There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over water at the moment the sun has gone but the sky has not yet surrendered its light, and if you have ever stood at the edge of a great strait as that hour arrived, you will know the feeling this history begins with, a feeling of suspension, of the world holding its breath between one age and the next, and it is in exactly that hour, on the waters where a narrow channel called the Bosphorus divides one continent from another, that we begin, quietly, to look toward a city that for more than 1,000 years called itself simply the city, the one place, and meant it without exaggeration, because for the people who lived within its walls there truly was no other place that mattered quite so much, and for the people who lived beyond its walls, in the deserts of Arabia or the forests of Rus or the cold halls of Western Europe, the mere rumor of its towers and domes was enough to shape their dreams of what a city could be. We are speaking, of course, of Constantinople, though before it wore that name it was called Byzantium, a modest Greek trading town on a rocky promontory where the currents of the strait swirl in such a way that ships have always found safe harbor there, and it is worth pausing on that geography before we move forward into the long centuries of emperors and armies and councils and fires, because geography, more than any single ruler or any single battle, is what made this story possible in the first place, and if you allow yourself simply to picture the shape of the land, the peninsula reaching out into the water like a hand, the deep natural harbor along its northern edge that sailors would come to call the Golden Horn, the way the currents of the Bosphorus made the crossing from Europe to Asia both possible and perilous depending on the season, you will begin to understand why, out of all the cities of the ancient world, it was this one that would endure the longest, would absorb the most, and would in the end become the last living fragment of the Roman world stretched impossibly across more than a millennium of history. This is not a story that moves quickly, and it is not meant to. It is a slow unfolding, chapter by chapter, of the life of an empire that its own citizens never called Byzantine at all, a term invented by scholars centuries after the last emperor fell, but that we use today because it distinguishes this later, Greek-speaking, Christian, Eastern continuation of Rome from the earlier Latin-speaking empire of the Caesars, even though the people themselves, right up until the final hour, called themselves Romaoi, Romans, and believed, with a conviction that outlasted every disaster history could throw at them, that they were the unbroken heirs of Augustus and Trajan and Constantine, ruling not a new kingdom but the same eternal state that had governed the Mediterranean world since before the birth of Christ. Let your mind settle into that idea for a moment, because it will carry us through everything that follows. While the western half of the Roman world, the Italy of the Caesars, the Gaul of the legions, the Britain at the edge of the map, slipped by the 5th century into the hands of Gothic kings and Frankish chieftains, the eastern half, centered here on this peninsula between two seas, did not fall. It endured. It endured plague and earthquake, it endured religious schism and civil war, it endured the armies of Persia and the armies of the Arab Caliphate and the armies of the Crusaders and, at the very last, the armies of the Ottoman Turks, and each time it endured, it changed a little, shedding one skin and growing another, until the empire that closed its final chapter in the year 1453 would have looked, to a Roman senator of the age of Augustus, almost entirely unrecognizable, and yet the thread connecting the two was never actually broken. Picture, if you will, the walls. Long before we walk through the centuries of emperors, let the image of the Theodosian walls settle into your mind, because these walls are, in a very real sense, one of the central characters of this whole story, a triple line of fortifications stretching nearly 4 miles across the base of the peninsula, towers rising every 50 or 60 yards along their length, a moat before them and an inner citadel behind, built in the 5th century under the Emperor Theodosius II and strengthened again and again across the centuries that followed, walls so formidable that they turned back siege after siege, army after army, for the better part of 1,000 years, walls that meant a boy born inside the city in the year 900 could live his entire life, marry, raise children, grow old, and die of natural causes, all while the world beyond those walls burned and reformed itself again and again, and never once see an enemy soldier set foot inside the city itself. That is the strange, slow gift of Constantinople across so much of its history, a kind of shelter, a kind of permanence, even while the world outside its gates was anything but permanent, and it is that quality, more than any single dramatic event, that we want you to carry with you as you drift toward sleep tonight and on the nights that follow, because this is not, in the end, a story of sudden shocks. It is a story of centuries settling slowly one upon another like sediment at the bottom of the strait, each layer quiet in itself, each layer part of something that, taken all together, became one of the longest-lived states in human history. Before we arrive at Constantine, the emperor for whom the city would be renamed, we should sit for a moment with what came before him, because Byzantium, the town, had already existed for the better part of 1,000 years by the time he ever set foot upon its soil, founded, according to the old Greek stories, by a colonist named Byzas who consulted the oracle at Delphi and was told to build his city opposite the land of the blind, a riddle that made sense only once he arrived at the site and saw that an earlier group of Greek settlers had built their own town, Chalcedon, on the opposite Asian shore, in a spot so plainly inferior to the peninsula on the European side that founding it there could only be described as a kind of blindness, an inability to see the obvious advantages of the northern harbor, the swirling currents that brought fish in astonishing abundance, the easy defensibility of a site surrounded on three sides by water. For centuries, Byzantium lived the ordinary life of a middling Greek city, sometimes independent, sometimes under the sway of Athens or Sparta or the Persian satraps, sometimes paying tribute to Rome once Roman power crept eastward and swallowed the Greek world piece by piece, and there is a particular pleasure, a particular calm, in imagining those centuries of quiet obscurity, fishermen hauling their nets in the Golden Horn, merchants haggling over grain and wine in the small agora, none of them aware that their unremarkable town on its rocky point would one day become the capital of the earth, the new Rome, the city that Christian pilgrims and Muslim conquerors and Renaissance scholars alike would speak of in tones reserved for legend. It is worth noting, too, before we move into the age of emperors, that Byzantium's fortunes rose and fell more than once even in its pre-imperial life. In the late 2nd century after Christ, the town made the fatal political misstep of backing the wrong claimant in a Roman civil war, supporting a general named Pescennius Niger against his rival Septimius Severus, and when Severus won, as the victors in such contests usually do, he turned the full weight of Roman military anger against the city that had defied him, besieging it for nearly 3 years until its defenders, starved and exhausted, could resist no longer, and when it finally fell, Severus in his fury ordered its walls torn down, its public buildings stripped of their honors, its political status reduced to that of a mere village dependent upon its neighbor Perinthus, a humiliation that might have ended the story of Byzantium forever, a small town punished into irrelevance and left to fade from history's memory. And yet even Severus, once his anger cooled, seems to have recognized something in the site itself, some quality that made it worth preserving rather than abandoning entirely, because within a few years he had begun rebuilding what he had destroyed, restoring the city's walls, constructing new public buildings, laying the groundwork, without perhaps fully intending it, for the far greater transformation that would come a little more than a century later, when another emperor, arriving at this same strategic crossroads between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, would look at this modest rebuilt town and see in it the future capital of the entire Roman world. That emperor's name was Constantine, and it is with him, in the early decades of the 4th century, that our long and unhurried journey through the history of the Byzantine Empire will properly begin. But for now, in this quiet opening hour, let us simply rest in the image of the strait at dusk, the water calm, the gulls settling onto the rooftops of the old town, the last light catching the hills on the Asian shore, and let ourselves drift slowly, gently, into the deeper currents of this story, a story that will carry us across more than 11 centuries, through the reigns of more than 90 emperors, through golden ages and dark ages, through plagues and earthquakes and sieges and councils, until at last, in the final chapter, we arrive at a May morning in the year 1453 when the long story finally, quietly, comes to its close. For now, though, there is no need to hurry. The centuries are long, and we have all the time in the world to walk through them together, slowly, the way the last light moves across still water. By the beginning of the 4th century after Christ, the Roman Empire had grown so vast, stretching from the mists of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, from the forests of the Rhine to the sands of North Africa, that no single administration seated in Italy could easily govern it all, and this simple, practical difficulty of distance and communication had already, decades before Constantine, pushed Roman emperors to experiment with dividing authority, appointing co-rulers, establishing regional capitals closer to the frontiers where trouble most often brewed, and it is against this backdrop of an empire straining under its own size that we should understand the rise of the man who would eventually give the city its new name and its new purpose. Constantine was born around the year 272 in the city of Nisus, in what is now Serbia, the son of a Roman officer named Constantius Chlorus and a woman named Helena, whose own later life would become entwined with some of the most cherished legends of Christian pilgrimage, and his early years were spent, as was common for the sons of ambitious Roman officers, moving through the machinery of imperial service, observing at close range the elaborate and often dangerous political system that Emperor Diocletian had constructed to manage the empire, a system historians call the Tetrarchy, the rule of four, in which 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars divided the enormous territory of Rome between them, each responsible for a quarter of the empire's defense and administration. It was, on paper, an elegant solution to an impossible problem, but in practice, as so often happens when several ambitious men are given nearly equal shares of supreme power, the Tetrarchy proved fragile, and when Constantine's father died in the year 306 while campaigning in Britain, the soldiers under his command, following an old and often disruptive Roman tradition, proclaimed Constantine himself as emperor on the spot, setting in motion nearly 2 decades of shifting alliances, civil wars, and careful political maneuvering that would eventually leave Constantine as the sole ruler of the entire Roman world, a position no single man had held uncontested in a very long time. The details of those campaigns, the marches and countermarches through Gaul and Italy, the famous battle at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome in the year 312 where Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius, a battle that later Christian writers would surround with the story of a vision in the sky, a cross of light and the words in this sign you will conquer, need not detain us long here in this calm retelling, because what matters most for our purposes is not the mechanics of how Constantine won his wars but what he chose to do once he had won them, because a man who has just spent the better part of 20 years fighting his way to the top of the Roman world does not, as a rule, make decisions lightly, and Constantine's decision to build an entirely new capital city was very far from a light one. He did not choose Byzantium immediately or carelessly. Ancient sources tell us that Constantine first considered other sites for his great new city, including the plain near ancient Troy, a location heavy with symbolic weight given Rome's own legendary Trojan origins through the hero Aeneas, and it is said, though we should hold such stories with the gentle skepticism appropriate to legend, that Constantine had even begun laying out walls at Troy before some combination of practical advisors and, in the more colorful versions of the tale, divine intervention convinced him to look instead toward the Bosphorus, toward that same rocky peninsula that Severus had once punished and then rebuilt. Whatever the precise sequence of decisions, by the year 324, having finally defeated his last rival, an Eastern emperor named Licinius, in a series of battles that brought him to this very stretch of water, Constantine stood at Byzantium and made his choice, and the ancient historians describe him walking the boundaries of his new city himself, spear in hand, tracing the line the walls would follow, and when his attendants, astonished at how far he was extending the perimeter, asked how much further he intended to go, he is said to have answered that he would go on until the one who was leading him, meaning some unseen divine guide, decided to stop, a story that captures, even if it did not happen in precisely this way, the sheer scale of ambition Constantine brought to this project. Construction proceeded with extraordinary speed for a city of such intended grandeur, drawing on the resources of the entire empire, marble and columns and statues transported from older cities across the Mediterranean world, craftsmen and laborers summoned from every province, and on the 11th of May in the year 330, Constantine formally dedicated his new capital, which he modestly, or perhaps not so modestly, named Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine, though its official ceremonial title, the one used in the elaborate court documents of later centuries, was New Rome, a name meant to convey not that this city was some lesser imitation of the old Rome on the Tiber but that it was, in a very real legal and spiritual sense, Rome itself, transplanted, renewed, continuing. This idea, the idea of translation, of Rome moving rather than ending, is worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because it explains so much of what follows across the coming centuries. Constantine populated his new Senate with members drawn from across the aristocracy of the empire, some transplanted directly from the old Roman Senate in Italy, and he established the same offices, the same titles, the same legal traditions that had governed Rome for centuries, so that a visitor arriving in Constantinople in the later 4th century would have found not some foreign Eastern court but a recognizably Roman government, conducting its business in Latin, honoring Roman law, tracing its authority back through an unbroken line to Augustus and Julius Caesar and before them, to the semi-legendary kings of early Rome itself. And yet, even from its founding, the new capital carried within it seeds of the transformation that would eventually make it something distinct from old Rome, something we today call Byzantine. The city's population spoke, in daily life, not Latin but Greek, the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries before Rome ever arrived, and while the imperial administration would continue to use Latin for formal purposes for a few more centuries, the deeper cultural fabric of the city, its literature, its marketplace conversations, its street corner arguments about theology and philosophy, was Greek from the very beginning, a linguistic reality that would only deepen over time until, by the 7th century, Greek had fully replaced Latin even in official government use. More significant still was the new capital's relationship with the Christian faith. Constantine himself, whatever the exact private state of his own beliefs, a matter historians continue to debate with real seriousness, had already in the year 313 issued the Edict of Milan alongside his then co-emperor Licinius, granting toleration to Christians across the empire after decades and, in places, centuries of intermittent persecution, and his new city, unlike old Rome with its ancient temples to Jupiter and Venus and the countless other gods of the traditional pantheon, was conceived from its very foundation as a Christian capital, adorned with churches rather than pagan temples, its skyline meant from the start to be marked by the sign of the cross rather than the old gods of the Capitoline Hill. We should be careful here not to imagine that paganism vanished overnight, because it did not, and the old traditions lingered in corners of the empire, including within Constantinople itself, for generations after Constantine's death, but the direction of travel was set, unmistakably, from that founding day in 330 onward, and it is this fusion, Roman law and Roman governance wedded to Greek language and culture wedded to Christian faith, that would define the civilization we now call Byzantine. For the next 11 centuries, a civilization that never thought of itself as a new thing at all but simply as Rome, continuing, adapting, enduring. Constantine himself would rule for only a handful of years after his city's dedication, dying in the year 337, and in the manner of so many things surrounding his complicated legacy, even his death carries a certain symbolic weight, for it is said he postponed his own baptism until his final illness, a practice not unusual for the period, when some believers delayed the sacrament in the hope of dying in a state as close to sinless as possible, and so the man who did more than any other single individual to align the Roman state with the Christian faith entered that faith formally only at the very end of his life, a quiet, almost understated close to a reign that had reshaped the ancient world. What he left behind him was not yet the mature Byzantine civilization that would flower under later emperors, but the foundation was laid, the walls were rising, the churches were being built, and on the low hills above the Golden Horn, a city was beginning its long, slow transformation from a modest Greek trading town into the greatest metropolis the medieval world would ever know, a city that within 2 centuries would house perhaps 500,000 people, more than any city in Europe would hold again until many hundreds of years later, a city whose markets would draw silk from China and furs from Scandinavia and spices from India, a city that travelers from every corner of the known world would come simply to see, and having seen it, would carry home stories of its splendor that grew, with each retelling, only more wondrous. Let that image settle now as we close this chapter, the young city rising on its 7 hills in imitation of old Rome, its walls not yet the mighty Theodosian fortifications of a century later but already substantial, its churches new and gleaming, its harbor filling slowly with the ships of merchants who sensed, perhaps before anyone else, that something significant was taking root on this quiet peninsula between 2 seas. And let us rest here for a moment before we move forward in the next chapter into the turbulent and transformative 6th century, the age of an emperor named Justinian, under whom this new Rome would reach a height of ambition and splendor that even Constantine himself could scarcely have imagined. 2 centuries can pass very quietly when we choose to let them, and much did happen in the years between Constantine's death and the rise of the emperor who occupies this chapter, wars along the Danube, theological councils debating the precise nature of Christ in language so careful and so contested that entire branches of the church would eventually separate over single words, the slow but unmistakable decline and final extinguishing of Roman authority in the western provinces, where in the year 476 the last emperor to rule in Italy, a boy with the almost mockingly grand name Romulus Augustulus, was quietly deposed by a Germanic commander named Odoacer, an event that later historians would mark as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, though it is worth noting that almost no one living through it at the time seems to have regarded it as quite so dramatic a turning point as we do now, looking back. For the Eastern Empire, centered here in Constantinople, that Western collapse was a matter of concern and occasional military response but not, crucially, an ending, because the machinery of Roman government, the tax collectors and the law courts and the standing armies and the imperial bureaucracy, continued to function in the East exactly as it always had, and it is this continuity, unbroken while the West fragmented into a patchwork of Gothic and Frankish and Vandal kingdoms, that allows us to speak of Byzantine history not as something separate from Roman history but as its direct, uninterrupted continuation. By the early 6th century, this Eastern Roman state, wealthy from the trade routes that passed through its capital, stable in its administration, was ready, under the right leadership, to attempt something extraordinary, and the right leadership arrived, somewhat improbably, in the person of a peasant's son from the rural Balkans named Petrus Sabatius, who had been adopted and educated by his uncle Justin, a soldier who rose through the ranks of the imperial guard to become, in the year 518, emperor himself, and who, recognizing his own limited education and advancing age, relied heavily on his talented nephew for administration, a nephew who took the name Justinian upon his uncle's death in 527 and who would rule, first alongside Justin and then alone, for nearly 4 decades, one of the longest and most consequential reigns in the entire history of the empire. Justinian's ambitions were, from the very beginning of his sole rule, vast in a way that few emperors before or after him would attempt to match. He seems to have looked out from his palace across the Bosphorus and seen not merely an Eastern Roman state content to hold what it already possessed, but the whole of the old Roman world, including the western provinces now lost to Germanic kings, as territory rightfully his to reclaim, a restoration of Roman unity that he pursued with a single-mindedness that would define his entire reign and reshape the map of the Mediterranean, for better and for worse, for generations afterward. But before we follow Justinian's armies westward, we should pause on a figure whose importance to this story is at least equal to his own, a woman named Theodora, whom Justinian married in the year 525, several years before his accession to the throne, and whose origins were, by the standards of Roman aristocratic marriage, almost scandalously humble, for Theodora had been, according to the sometimes hostile but historically valuable account of the contemporary writer Procopius, an actress and performer in the theaters of Constantinople in her youth, a profession that carried in Roman society a reputation not far removed from disrepute, and yet Justinian, defying convention and even requiring his uncle Justin to change the law to permit such a marriage, made her not merely his wife but, once he became emperor, his full partner in rule. A woman whose name appears alongside his own in the laws and the mosaics and the official acts of the reign, and equal in a way that was almost without precedent for a Roman empress. Theodora's steel proved decisive at what might otherwise have been the ending point of Justinian's entire reign, in the year 532, only 5 years into his rule, when long-simmering tensions in Constantinople, tied partly to rival factions of chariot racing fans known as the Blues and the Greens, whose loyalties extended well beyond the racetrack into genuine political and even theological allegiances, exploded into what history remembers as the Nika riots, named for the rallying cry of the rioters, Nika, meaning victory, and for several terrifying days the mob controlled much of the city, setting fires that destroyed a great swath of central Constantinople, including the original church of Hagia Sophia, and demanding the removal of Justinian's most unpopular ministers, and eventually the removal of Justinian himself, going so far as to proclaim a rival emperor from among the old aristocracy. The imperial court, gathered in a moment of genuine terror within the palace, debated flight, debated whether the ships in the harbor should be ready to carry the emperor away to safety, and it is at precisely this moment, according to Procopius, that Theodora rose and delivered words that have echoed through the centuries since, declaring, in effect, that flight might be safe but that she herself preferred to die as an empress rather than live as a fugitive, that purple, the color of imperial rank, makes a fine burial shroud, and whether her words survive in exactly the form Procopius recorded or have been shaped somewhat by the demands of dramatic history writing, the substance of the moment is not in doubt, because Justinian, steadied by his wife's resolve, chose to stay, and dispatched his generals, including a young officer named Belisarius who would soon become the empire's greatest soldier, to put down the revolt by force, a brutal suppression in which tens of thousands of rioters were killed in the city's great chariot racing stadium, the Hippodrome, in a single terrible afternoon. It is a somber episode to sit with, and we do not linger on its violence, but its consequence for the shape of the city and the empire is worth understanding, because out of the ashes of the burned original Hagia Sophia, Justinian resolved to build something that would surpass every church that had ever been constructed anywhere in the Christian world, and the building he commissioned, designed by 2 mathematicians and engineers, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, remains to this day. One of the most extraordinary achievements of architecture in human history, a vast dome, appearing almost afloat weightlessly above the nave, supported by an ingenious system of pendentives that solved an engineering problem no one had fully solved before, light pouring in through a ring of windows at the dome's base in such a way that ancient writers describe the interior as seeming to glow from within, as though the light itself had no earthly source. Completed with remarkable speed in a little under 6 years, and dedicated in the year 537, Hagia Sophia was, and to this day remains, breathtaking, and Justinian himself, according to a story too fitting to omit even if its precise wording may be legend rather than fact, is said to have entered the completed church, looked up into the vastness of the dome, and declared, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee," a reference to the great temple of the biblical King Solomon in Jerusalem. And the boast, audacious as it sounds, was not, in truth, much of an exaggeration, because for close to 1,000 years, until the completion of certain Renaissance cathedrals in Western Europe, Hagia Sophia would remain the largest enclosed space, the largest church interior, anywhere on earth. While the Great Dome rose above the city, Justinian's other, quieter, but perhaps even more consequential project was unfolding in the law courts and the offices of his legal scholars, for the emperor had commissioned a systematic codification of Roman law, gathering the scattered, sometimes contradictory legal rulings and imperial edicts of centuries into a single, organized body of legislation known collectively as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, a project overseen by a brilliant legal scholar named Tribonian, and this codification, completed in stages through the 530s, would prove to be one of Justinian's most enduring legacies, because centuries later, when the states of medieval and early modern Western Europe began developing their own legal systems, it was Justinian's corpus, preserved and copied through the centuries, that provided the foundation upon which so much of continental European law would eventually be built, an influence still traceable today in the legal codes of many nations around the world. Meanwhile, on the battlefields of the Western Mediterranean, Justinian's dream of restoring Roman unity was proceeding, at least for a time, with startling success. His general Belisarius, the same officer who had helped suppress the Nika riots, sailed in the year 533 with a modest force to North Africa, where the Vandal kingdom, having ruled the old Roman province of Africa for a century, was overthrown with surprising speed, restoring that wealthy grain-producing region to Roman control, and Belisarius followed this triumph with a campaign into Italy itself, capturing Rome from the Ostrogothic kingdom that had ruled there, though the Italian war would prove far longer and more grinding than the African campaign, dragging on for nearly 2 decades through multiple phases and multiple commanders, devastating much of the Italian peninsula in the process, a reconquest that succeeded, ultimately, but at a cost in lives and treasure and the ruin of Italy's cities, that some historians have questioned as worth the price. It is worth pausing here in this quiet retelling to acknowledge that Justinian's reign, for all its genuine glories, the Dome of Hagia Sophia, the Great Law Code, the recovered provinces of Africa and Italy and parts of Spain, was also a reign shadowed by real suffering, because in the year 541, a pandemic, now generally believed by modern researchers to have been an early outbreak of bubonic plague, arrived in Constantinople, likely carried along the same trade routes that had made the city wealthy, and swept through the empire with a mortality so severe that ancient accounts describe the city's dead being loaded onto ships and towed out to be buried in mass graves because the cemeteries could no longer keep pace, a catastrophe that some modern estimates suggest killed a significant portion of the empire's entire population and that recurred in waves for the following 2 centuries, weakening the very foundations of the wealth and manpower upon which Justinian's ambitious wars depended. Theodora herself would not live to see the end of her husband's long reign, dying in the year 548, and the historian Procopius, whose public writings praised the imperial couple in the most glowing terms, would in a separate secret work only discovered and published centuries later, known now as the Secret History, paint an almost startlingly different portrait of both Justinian and Theodora, accusing them of cruelty, corruption, and vice in language so harsh that historians still debate how much of it reflects genuine grievance and how much reflects the bitter disappointment of a court official who felt his talents had gone unrewarded, and this tension between the public monument, the dome of Hagia Sophia standing serene and golden above the city, and the private, contested memory of the people who built it, is itself a fitting reminder that history, even calm history, even history meant to ease us gently towards sleep, is rarely made only of simple, single truths. Justinian died in the year 565, having ruled for 38 years, leaving behind an empire larger than it had been in over a century, a legal legacy that would echo for a millennium and a half, and a church that remains, to this very day, one of the most visited and most photographed buildings on earth. But he also left behind an empire financially exhausted by decades of war and plague, its treasury drained, its western conquests already showing signs of the strain that would, within a few short years of his death, begin to unravel as new invaders, a Germanic people called the Lombards, poured into Italy and claimed much of what Belisarius and his fellow generals had so painfully reclaimed. We will follow those unraveling threads and the new dangers gathering on the empire's eastern frontier in the chapters that lie ahead. But for now, let us simply hold in our minds the image of golden light falling through the high windows of Hagia Sophia onto the marble floor far below, the quiet hum of prayer rising into that vast dome, and let ourselves rest for a moment in the knowledge that whatever storms would come afterward, this one building, born out of riot and fire and the ambition of an extraordinary and imperfect emperor, would stand, in one form or another, for the rest of this long story and for many centuries beyond its ending. The decades following Justinian's death were, for the most part, a slow contraction, a gradual loosening of the emperor's grip on the vast territories he had reclaimed at such cost, and there is no need for us to move quickly through the reigns of his immediate successors, men whose names, Justin II, Tiberius II, Maurice, drift past in the historical record largely as administrators managing decline rather than architects of new triumphs, holding the eastern frontier against a resurgent Persian Empire under its Sassanid dynasty, holding the Balkan frontier against new peoples, Avars and Slavs, pressing down from the north, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, watching the western reconquests of Justinian's day erode under the pressure of Lombard invasion in Italy and Visigothic resurgence in Spain. It is the reign of the Emperor Maurice, and more particularly its violent ending, that sets in motion the crisis at the center of this chapter, because in the year 602, after Maurice attempted to economize by ordering his Balkan army to winter beyond the Danube rather than return to comfortable garrisons for the cold months, that army mutinied, marched on Constantinople under an officer named Phocas, and in the chaos that followed, Maurice and his sons were captured and executed, and Phocas, a man whom nearly every surviving source describes in deeply unflattering terms, seized the throne in a coup that would prove catastrophic not merely for Maurice's family but for the empire as a whole. The Persian king, Khosrow II, had in fact owed his own throne years earlier to Maurice's military support, and upon hearing of his old ally's murder, Khosrow declared war on Phocas's usurping regime, ostensibly to avenge Maurice but in practice to pursue a far more ambitious goal, nothing less than the conquest of the entire Eastern Roman world, and what followed, across the first quarter of the 7th century, was the most severe crisis the empire had faced since its founding, a war so devastating that for a time it genuinely appeared as though the whole Eastern Roman state might simply cease to exist. Persian armies swept through Roman Syria, capturing the great city of Antioch, and then, in the year 614, they took Jerusalem itself, an event of profound psychological shock to a Christian empire, because the Persian forces, in the sack of the Holy City, seized what Christians believed to be the true cross, the actual relic of Christ's crucifixion, and carried it away into Persian territory, a loss that struck at the very religious identity of the Roman state in a way that mere territorial defeat, however severe, could not fully capture. The Persians pressed on into Egypt, seizing Alexandria and the grain-rich Nile Valley that had fed Constantinople for centuries, and by the early 620s Persian forces had even reached the Bosphorus itself, camping on the Asian shore directly across the water from the capital, close enough that the people of Constantinople could see the campfires of an enemy army at night from their own city walls. It was into this genuinely desperate situation that a new emperor, Heraclius, had risen in the year 610, arriving from North Africa by ship with a fleet organized by his father, the governor of Carthage, to overthrow the widely despised Phocas, and for the first decade of his reign Heraclius appeared, to outside observers, to preside over nothing but continued catastrophe. The Persian advances we have just described unfolding largely on his watch, the treasury emptied, the empire's core, territories in Anatolia repeatedly raided, and it would have been entirely understandable, at this low point, for history to have recorded Heraclius merely as the emperor who watched Rome's eastern provinces slip away for good. Instead, in one of the most remarkable reversals in ancient or medieval military history, Heraclius spent several years rebuilding the empire's shattered finances and armies, reportedly even melting down church treasures with the cooperation of the patriarch to fund the war effort, framing the coming campaign not merely as a war of territorial recovery, but as something closer to a holy struggle to reclaim the true cross and the sacred sites of Christianity from Persian hands. And then, in the year 622, rather than attempting to defend Anatolia directly against continued Persian pressure, he embarked on an audacious campaign, striking deep into Persian territory itself, into the Caucasus and eventually into the Persian heartland in Mesopotamia. A strategy of taking the war to the enemy's own homeland that few had expected and that caught the overextended Persian forces badly off guard. Across several years of hard campaigning, Heraclius won a string of victories, and by 627 his forces had advanced close enough to the Persian capital that Khosrow's own nobles, having lost confidence in their king after so many reversals, rose up, deposed him, and executed him, and the new Persian government sued for peace, agreeing to withdraw entirely from all the Roman territories they had occupied and to return the true cross, which Heraclius carried back to Jerusalem in a ceremony of restoration in the year 630 that ancient writers describe in tones of overwhelming triumph and relief, the emperor who had inherited near ruin now standing as the empire's savior, having achieved what seemed, for a brief shining moment, like the complete and total vindication of everything the Roman state stood for. And yet, and this is one of the more sobering rhythms that recur throughout Byzantine history, the very completeness of that triumph concealed a deeper vulnerability, because both the Roman and Persian empires had, after more than 2 decades of brutal total war against one another, exhausted themselves almost beyond recovery, their treasuries empty, their veteran armies decimated, their border provinces devastated by years of campaigning back and forth, and it was at precisely this moment of mutual exhaustion in the Arabian Peninsula far to the south, that a new force was gathering that neither the Romans nor the Persians, focused entirely on their own long rivalry, had thought to take seriously. The Prophet Muhammad had, by the time of his death in 632, united much of Arabia under the new faith of Islam, and his successors, the caliphs, inherited not merely a religious movement but a remarkably capable and highly motivated military force, and in the years immediately following Heraclius's triumphant return of the true cross to Jerusalem, Arab armies began moving north out of Arabia into Roman Syria and Palestine, provinces that only a decade earlier had been fought over so bitterly. Between Rome and Persia and that now, exhausted and undermanned, offered far less resistance than either empire could have managed in earlier decades. At the Battle of Yarmouk in the year 636, fought along a river valley on the border of modern Syria and Jordan, an Arab army decisively defeated the main Roman field force sent to hold the province, a defeat so complete that it effectively ended organized Roman resistance in Syria and Palestine, and within a very short span of years, Jerusalem itself, so recently restored to Christian rule with such elaborate ceremony, passed into Muslim hands, along with the whole of Syria, and soon afterward, Egypt as well, the wealthy grain province whose loss struck yet another severe blow to the empire's finances and food supply. Heraclius, watching from Constantinople as province after province he had so recently, at such cost, helped defend against Persia now fell instead to this new and unanticipated power, is said to have looked out toward Syria as he prepared to depart for the last time and uttered words of sorrowful farewell to the province, a story that, whether precisely accurate or not, captures something true about the emotional weight of these years, an emperor who had achieved what looked like the complete salvation of his empire only to watch, within a handful of years, an entirely new and unforeseen threat strip away some of Rome's oldest and wealthiest territories. He died in the year 641, his final years shadowed by these losses and by troubling questions over his own succession, but the empire he left behind, though reduced, was not destroyed, and it is worth pausing here to reflect on why, because the same Arab armies that had swept so quickly through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt would spend the following decades attempting, repeatedly, to take Constantinople itself, and would repeatedly fail, turned back first by the sheer strength of the Theodosian walls and later, in a siege of 674 to 678 and again in a truly massive siege in 717 and 718, by a devastating incendiary weapon the Byzantines had developed, a mixture whose exact composition remains uncertain even to modern chemists but that could be projected through tubes onto enemy ships and that would continue burning even on the surface of water, a weapon history remembers as Greek fire, and which the Byzantines themselves regarded, quite literally, as a secret entrusted to them by heaven itself, never to be revealed to any foreign power. The empire that emerged from these 7th century crises, having lost Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and eventually much of North Africa to the new Arab Caliphate, was territorially far smaller than the state Justinian had ruled a century earlier, reduced now largely to Anatolia, Constantinople and its immediate hinterland, portions of the Balkans and Greece, and scattered outposts in Italy and Sicily. But it was also, in a sense, a leaner and more sustainable state, its administration reorganized during these very decades into a new system of military provinces called themes, in which soldiers were settled on land in exchange for hereditary military service, a reform that allowed the empire to maintain substantial defensive forces without the crushing expense of the old professional standing armies, and it is this reorganized, contracted, but resilient state, Greek-speaking now almost entirely, its Latin heritage receding steadily into the background of its legal and ceremonial life, that historians generally mark as the true beginning of the mature Byzantine civilization, distinct in its shape and character from the broader late Roman world out of which it had emerged. We will spend the coming chapters exploring how this leaner empire, having weathered its gravest crisis, went on to face yet another profound internal struggle, this one not fought against foreign armies but fought within the churches and palaces of the empire itself, over the very nature of sacred images, a controversy history remembers as iconoclasm. And it is to that long and often painful chapter of Byzantine religious and cultural life that we will turn next. But for now, let us simply rest with the image of the true cross being carried once more through the gates of Jerusalem, Heraclius walking barefoot in humility before it according to the old accounts, a moment of triumph that, like so many moments in this long history, would prove far more fragile than anyone standing in that procession could possibly have known. There is something quietly fascinating about the fact that one of the longest and most bitter internal struggles in Byzantine history was fought not over territory or succession but over a question that might, at first glance, seem almost abstract, the question of whether it was permissible to paint an image of Christ or the saints and to venerate that image with candles and incense and prayer, and yet this question, which we today call the Iconoclast controversy, consumed the empire's religious and political energy for more than a century, split families and monasteries and the imperial court itself into opposing camps, and left behind scars, and also treasures, that would shape Byzantine art and theology for the rest of the empire's existence. To understand how such a question could grow so consequential, we should sit for a moment with the devotional world of the 8th century Byzantine Christian, a world in which icons, painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, were not simply decorative art in the way we might casually think of a painting hanging in a modern gallery, but were understood by most ordinary believers as genuine points of contact with the sacred figures they depicted, objects before which one prayed, which one kissed in greeting upon entering a church, which were carried in procession during times of plague or siege in the belief that the holy figure represented would extend real, tangible protection to the city, and this depth of devotion, this sense that the icon was not merely a picture but almost a window into the presence of the holy person shown, is essential to understanding why the controversy over these images could become so passionately, sometimes violently, contested. The controversy is generally understood to have begun in earnest under the Emperor Leo III, who came to power in 717, the very year of that massive Arab siege of Constantinople we mentioned in the previous chapter, a siege he successfully repelled, establishing himself as a capable and forceful ruler, and it was roughly a decade into his reign, around the year 726, that Leo began to move against the veneration of icons, and historians have long debated exactly what drove this shift, with some ancient and modern accounts pointing to a massive volcanic eruption in the Aegean that Leo may have interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure with the Church's use of images, others pointing to the emperor's own theological convictions, shaped perhaps by contact with the aniconic traditions of the expanding Islamic world to the empire's east and south, and still others emphasizing more practical political motivations, a desire to curb the growing wealth and independent influence of monasteries, which had become major centers of icon veneration and major holders of land and resources outside direct imperial control. Whatever the precise mixture of motives, Leo's government began removing and destroying icons across the empire, most famously ordering the removal of a large image of Christ that stood above the Chulka Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the imperial palace, an act that provoked, according to contemporary accounts, immediate and passionate resistance from a crowd of onlookers, some of whom reportedly attacked the soldier sent to carry out the order, and this pattern, imperial edict meeting popular and monastic resistance, would recur again and again across the following decades as successive emperors, particularly Leo's son Constantine V, pursued iconoclast policy with even greater intensity than Leo had. Constantine V, who ruled from 741 to 775, is a figure whose military and administrative competence even his fiercest religious critics, the very monks whose icons he suppressed and whose monasteries he sometimes confiscated, grudgingly acknowledged in their less polemical moments, because he was, by most measures, an effective and successful ruler in purely secular terms, winning victories against the Bulgarians and Arabs and stabilizing imperial finances. But it is his religious policy, for which he is remembered most vividly in the surviving sources that, it must be said, were overwhelmingly written by the very iconophile, meaning pro-icon, monastic writers who suffered under his rule, and who therefore portray him in the darkest possible terms, giving him the deliberately insulting nickname Kapronimos, roughly translatable as dung-named, referring to an unflattering legend about his infant baptism, a nickname that tells us at least as much about the bitterness of the surviving sources as it does about the emperor himself. Under Constantine V, iconoclast theology was given formal doctrinal backing at a church council held at Hieria in 754, a council that, notably, was not attended by the Pope in Rome or by the other major patriarchs of the Christian world outside imperial control, and which declared the veneration of icons to be a form of idolatry, ordering their removal from churches throughout the empire. And in the years that followed, monasteries that resisted this policy faced real persecution there. Monks sometimes forced into secular life, their communities dispersed, their most famous icons destroyed or painted over, a campaign whose intensity seems to have eased somewhat in the empire's final iconoclast decades, but that left, across roughly a century of intermittent enforcement, remarkably few surviving Byzantine icons from before this period. One of the reasons that some of the very oldest and most treasured Byzantine icons that do survive today are found not in Constantinople itself, but in the remote monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai Desert, far enough from the direct reach of imperial policy, and later under Islamic rather than Byzantine political control, to have escaped the systematic removal that swept through the heartland of the empire. The controversy did not resolve itself neatly or quickly, and it is worth pausing to note the remarkable role that women played in eventually restoring icon veneration, because it was not a male emperor but an empress, Irene, ruling first as regent for her young son Constantine VI and later, in an almost unprecedented move for a woman to hold, as sole reigning empress in her own right, who convened the Second Council of Nicaea in the year 787, a council that formally restored the veneration of icons, carefully distinguishing, in a theological formula that would remain influential for the rest of Byzantine history, between the worship, properly reserved for God alone, and veneration, a lesser form of honor and respect that could properly be shown to icons as windows toward the sacred figures they represented rather than as objects of worship in themselves. This first restoration of icons, however, did not mark the final end of the controversy, because in the early 9th century, following a period of military setbacks that some interpreted, once again, as signs of divine displeasure, iconoclasm was revived under a new set of emperors, beginning with Leo V in 815, and it would take another several decades, and another empress, Theodora, ruling as regent for her young son Michael III, before icons were restored a second and, this time, final time, in the year 843, an event still commemorated in the Orthodox liturgical calendar to this day as the Feast of Orthodoxy, celebrated each year on the first Sunday of Great Lent, a testament to how deeply this long controversy marked the religious identity and collective memory of the Byzantine Church. It is worth reflecting, in this calm and unhurried retelling, on what this century-long struggle over images actually meant for the empire beyond the theological arguments themselves, because the iconoclast controversy touched on questions that reached well beyond religious art alone, questions about the proper relationship between imperial and ecclesiastical authority, about the role of monasteries within Byzantine society and economy, about the empire's evolving relationship with the increasingly independent papacy in Rome, which had rejected iconoclasm from the beginning and whose relations with Constantinople were strained by the controversy in ways that would contribute, over the following centuries, to the gradual widening rift between the Latin and Greek branches of Christianity that would eventually culminate in formal schism. And yet, for all the genuine pain and disruption the controversy caused, it is also true that the final restoration of icons in 843 ushered in what many historians regard as one of the great creative flowerings of Byzantine art and culture. Because the theological victory of the iconophile position gave fresh confidence and fresh patronage to artists and craftsmen working in mosaic and fresco and painted panel, and the icon tradition that emerged from this settled theology with its distinctive, stylized forms, its golden backgrounds meant to suggest the light of heaven rather than any earthly landscape, its careful conventions for depicting the faces and gestures of Christ and the saints, would go on to influence religious art not only throughout the Byzantine world but across the Orthodox Christian world more broadly, in Russia, in the Balkans, in Georgia and Armenia, for many centuries after the Byzantine Empire itself had ceased to exist, a visual language still recognizable and still practiced by icon painters working in the Orthodox tradition today. We will see, in the chapters ahead, how the settling of this controversy coincided with, and perhaps helped enable, a broader Byzantine resurgence in the 9th and 10th centuries, a period of renewed military strength, renewed cultural confidence, and renewed territorial expansion that historians often call the Macedonian Renaissance, named for the dynasty of emperors who presided over it. And it is to the rise of that dynasty, and to the extraordinary emperors who would carry the Byzantine state to a height of power and prestige it had not known since the days of Justinian, that we will turn our attention next. But for now, let us simply rest with the image of golden light glinting off a newly restored icon in a quiet side chapel of Hagia Sophia, a small flame flickering before it in the stillness of an early morning, the long argument over its right to exist finally, after so many decades, settled. Every long story of decline and crisis needs, if it is to remain true to the actual rhythm of history rather than to a simpler narrative of steady collapse, its chapters of recovery and renewal, and few periods in the entire span of Byzantine history offer a clearer, more sustained example of such renewal than the era inaugurated in the year 867, when an emperor named Basil I came to power and founded a dynasty that history would call, somewhat inaccurately given that Basil himself likely had no particular connection to the ancient region, the Macedonian dynasty, a line of rulers that would govern the empire, with occasional interruption, for close to 2 centuries and would preside over what many historians consider the high point of medieval Byzantine civilization. Basil's own rise to power is one of the more remarkable stories of social mobility in the entire history of the empire, because he began life, by most accounts, in genuinely humble circumstances in the Balkans, the son of a peasant family, and arrived in Constantinople as a young man with little more than his own physical strength and a gift for handling horses, qualities that brought him first into the service of a wealthy nobleman and then, through a sequence of fortunate connections and his own evident talents, into the personal household of the reigning emperor, Michael III, where Basil rose with startling speed through positions of increasing trust and intimacy with the emperor, eventually becoming Michael's co-emperor in 866. The final step in Basil's ascent, it must be said plainly in this history that values honesty even in its gentlest moments, was neither gentle nor especially honorable, because in September of 867 Basil, evidently concerned that his own position remained precarious under Michael's increasingly erratic favor, had the emperor murdered in his own bedchamber, and ascended to sole rule over the very throne of the man who had raised him from obscurity, a beginning that sits uneasily alongside the genuine accomplishments of the dynasty he founded, and it is worth pausing on this discomfort rather than smoothing it away, because Byzantine history offers us, again and again, this same difficult pattern of remarkable achievement built upon foundations of real violence and real betrayal, a pattern common enough across the history of many medieval states that it should not surprise us, even as it should not be excused. Whatever the manner of his accession, Basil proved, across a reign lasting nearly 2 decades, to be a genuinely capable ruler, strengthening the empire's finances, reforming its legal code in a project that his successors would complete, and pursuing a more assertive military policy against the empire's neighbors than had been common in the more defensive decades that preceded him, but it was under his successors, and particularly under his grandson Constantine VII and later under the towering figure of Basil II, that the Macedonian dynasty would reach its full stride. Constantine VII, who reigned, though for much of his life more in name than in actual power, from 913 until his death in 959, occupies an unusual and rather touching place in Byzantine history, because he came to the throne as a child and spent long stretches of his early life sidelined by more forceful co-emperors and regents, particularly a capable naval commander named Romanos Lekapinos, who effectively ruled the empire for a quarter century while young Constantine was kept in a position of largely ceremonial authority, and rather than this marginalization crushing him, Constantine seems to have channeled his energies, during these long years on the sidelines of actual power, into scholarship, becoming one of the most genuinely learned rulers in the empire's history, personally overseeing and contributing to a series of remarkable works, including a treatise on imperial governance and foreign relations written explicitly as private advice for his own son, offering candid, sometimes startlingly frank assessments of the empire's neighboring peoples, their customs, their strengths and weaknesses, and the diplomatic strategies most likely to succeed in dealing with each of them. This scholarly bent was not merely a private hobby but reflected, and helped drive, a much broader cultural project underway across the Macedonian era, a systematic effort to gather, copy, and preserve the surviving literature of the ancient Greek and Roman world, a project of encyclopedic compilation in fields ranging from history to agriculture to military strategy to medicine. And it is worth pausing to appreciate just how much of what we today know of ancient Greek literature survives. Specifically because Byzantine scholars of this period took the trouble to copy older manuscripts, often crumbling papyrus texts centuries old, onto more durable parchment, a quiet, unglamorous labor of preservation carried out in monastery scriptoriums and imperial libraries that we owe an enormous, largely unacknowledged debt to, because without it, a great deal of classical literature that later fed directly into the Italian Renaissance many centuries afterward would simply not have survived at all. If Constantine VII represents the scholarly, cultural dimension of the Macedonian Renaissance, it is his descendant Basil II, who came to the throne as a boy in 976 and ruled, again with an early period of contested and shared authority, until his death in 1025, who represents its military and territorial dimension, and Basil II is, by almost any measure, one of the most formidable rulers in the entire history of the Byzantine Empire, a man whose reign, spanning nearly half a century, brought the empire's borders to their greatest extent since the days before the 7th century Arab conquests we discussed earlier in this history. Basil's early reign was consumed by a series of dangerous internal rebellions led by ambitious members of the empire's landed aristocracy, men who commanded substantial private armies and who twice came close to overthrowing him entirely, and these early struggles seem to have forged in the young emperor a hardness and a wariness of the great aristocratic families that would shape his policies for the rest of his life, leading him to favor smaller landholders over the great magnates whenever legislation and taxation policy allowed, a populist streak in its way, though one motivated as much by hard political calculation as by any particular sympathy for the peasantry. It is Basil's decades-long war against the Bulgarian Empire, however, for which he is most remembered, a conflict that began early in his reign and continued, through long stretches of grinding campaign season after campaign season, until its dramatic conclusion in 1014, when Basil's forces won a decisive victory over the Bulgarian army at a mountain pass known as Clydian. And it is here that we encounter one of the more chilling episodes in this long history, because ancient and later accounts describe Basil, following this victory, ordering the blinding of some 14 or 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, leaving one man in every 100 with a single remaining eye so that he could lead his blinded comrades home, a punishment of such calculated severity that when the Bulgarian ruler Samuel is said to have seen the returning column of his blinded army approaching, he collapsed and died shortly afterward, and Basil himself earned, from this episode, the grim posthumous nickname by which history still remembers him, Bulgarochtonos, the Bulgar Slayer. We do not linger on this episode to dwell in its horror, but simply to be honest, in this calm retelling, about the fact that the empire's periods of greatest territorial strength were not achieved through gentleness, and Basil's Bulgarian War, whatever its brutal conclusion, did succeed, finally, in bringing the entire Bulgarian state under Byzantine control for the first time, extending imperial authority across the whole of the Balkan Peninsula to the Danube, a territorial reach the empire would not match again for the rest of its existence. Beyond the Balkans, Basil's long reign also saw substantial Byzantine gains in the east, where imperial armies, taking advantage of political fragmentation among the various Arab emirates that had emerged from the weakening of the old unified caliphate, pushed the empire's eastern frontier deep into Syria and northern Mesopotamia, recovering, for a time, territories that had been lost to Islamic conquest nearly 4 centuries earlier, and by the time of Basil's death in 1025, the Byzantine Empire stretched from southern Italy in the west to the borders of Armenia and northern Syria in the east, from the Danube in the north to Crete and Cyprus in the Mediterranean, a territorial extent that made it, once again, unmistakably the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean world. Basil himself, according to the accounts of contemporaries, lived an almost austere personal life for an emperor of such power, avoiding the lavish ceremonial excess that had characterized some earlier reigns, remaining unmarried and, so far as the sources indicate, largely uninterested in the pleasures and comforts that his position would easily have afforded him, dedicating himself instead, with what one court historian described as an almost obsessive focus, to the business of governing and campaigning, and this personal severity, this near-total devotion to the practical work of rule, left the empire, at the moment of his death, both territorially vast and financially sound, its treasury, according to later accounts, holding a genuinely staggering reserve of gold accumulated across decades of careful, frugal administration. And yet, as we will see in the chapter that follows, this very success carried within it a quiet vulnerability, because Basil, so consumed by the practical work of rule across nearly 50 years on the throne, left no direct heir capable of matching his own formidable competence and the extraordinarily capable, extraordinarily centralized system of governance he had built and personally overseen for so long would, in the hands of far less capable successors in the decades immediately following his death, begin to show cracks that had been almost entirely invisible during his own lifetime, cracks that would widen, gradually and then with startling speed, into one of the most severe crises the empire had faced since the dark years of the 7th century. For now, though, let us rest in this high moment of Byzantine power. The empire's borders stretched wide across 3 continents worth of frontier, its libraries filled with newly copied volumes of ancient wisdom, its treasury heavy with gold, its old capital gleaming under the dome of Hagia Sophia as it had in the days of Justinian, a civilization that had weathered plague and siege and religious controversy and had emerged, in this Macedonian autumn, more powerful and more confident than it had been in centuries, unaware, as all such high moments in history tend to be, of just how much would change in the difficult decades that lay just beyond the horizon. History rarely moves in straight lines, and the decades following Basil II's death in 1025 offer one of the clearer illustrations of just how quickly a genuinely powerful state can begin to falter once the particular combination of circumstances and leadership that sustained its strength starts to come apart. And we should approach this chapter, as we have approached the others, without rushing toward its conclusion, taking time to understand how a sequence of individually modest decisions made by individually unremarkable rulers accumulated across roughly half a century into one of the most consequential defeats the Byzantine Empire would ever suffer. Basil left the throne, in the absence of children of his own, to his brother Constantine VIII, an emperor whose interests, by the account of nearly every surviving source, lay considerably more in the pleasures of court life, feasting, entertainment, and the enjoyment of his own authority, than in the demanding daily labor of administration and military command that had consumed his brother so completely. And Constantine's brief reign, followed by the reigns of a succession of husbands. Married to Basil's nieces, the sisters Zoe and Theodora, the last surviving members of the Macedonian bloodline, settled into a pattern that would recur across these middle decades of the 11th century, a pattern of short reigns, court intrigue, and a gradual, largely unintentional dismantling of the careful fiscal and military discipline that Basil had spent nearly 50 years building. It is worth pausing on Zoe herself, a genuinely striking figure in this history, a woman who, along with her sister Theodora, held the unique distinction of being the last direct heirs of the Macedonian dynasty, and whose own long life saw her married 3 times, each marriage elevating a new husband to the imperial throne beside her, a sequence of rulers, Romanos III, Michael IV, and later, through adoption, Michael V, none of whom possessed anything approaching Basil's capacity for governance, and whose short and often troubled reigns illustrate just how much the stability of the Macedonian system had depended on the presence of a genuinely exceptional individual at its center rather than on institutions robust enough to function equally well under lesser hands. Beneath these dynastic dramas playing out in the palace, a more structural problem was quietly deepening, because the theme system that had served the empire so well since the difficult 7th century, in which soldier farmers held hereditary land in exchange for military obligation, was gradually giving way, across the 10th and 11th centuries, to a pattern in which the great aristocratic families of Anatolia, the same class of powerful landed magnates whom Basil II had worked so hard throughout his reign to keep in check, increasingly absorbed smaller landholdings into vast private estates, eroding the class of independent soldier farmers upon which the old provincial defense system had depended, and successive weak governments in Constantinople, more concerned with court politics than with these slow-moving structural shifts occurring out in the provinces, allowed this erosion to continue largely unchecked. At the same time, the empire's military increasingly came to rely on mercenary forces, foreign soldiers, including Norman adventurers from Western Europe, Turkish auxiliaries, and various other hired contingents, paid for out of an imperial treasury that, though it had been left extraordinarily full at Basil's death, was steadily drained across the following decades by the extravagances of a succession of short-lived and often incompetent emperors, and this combination, a weakened provincial defense system and an increasingly expensive, less reliably loyal military establishment, left the empire's eastern frontier considerably more fragile than its impressive territorial extent on any contemporary map might have suggested. Into this weakening frontier came a new and, at the outset, poorly understood threat, a confederation of Turkic peoples known as the Seljuks, who had, over the preceding decades, migrated westward out of Central Asia, converted to Islam, and constructed a substantial and increasingly well-organized state across Persia and Mesopotamia, and whose warriors, skilled horse archers accustomed to fast-moving raiding warfare, began in the 1040s and with increasing frequency in the decades that followed, to press into Byzantine Armenia and eastern Anatolia, initially in raids rather than in any organized campaign of outright conquest, probing a frontier that, under Basil II, would have been defended by seasoned, well-supplied provincial forces, but that by the middle decades of the 11th century was often left to garrison forces that were undermanned, underpaid, and increasingly reluctant to risk their lives for a distant and unstable government in Constantinople. By the late 1060s, the situation on the eastern frontier had grown serious enough that even the fractious Byzantine court could no longer ignore it, and in 1068 a general named Romanos Diogenes, a capable soldier from the Anatolian military aristocracy, was married to the reigning empress Eudokia, and raised to the imperial throne specifically in the hope that his military experience could stabilize the crumbling eastern defenses, and Romanos, to his credit, threw himself into this task with real energy across the following 3 years, leading several campaigns into Anatolia aimed at driving back Seljuk raiding parties and restoring the integrity of the frontier, though he faced, throughout, the quiet hostility of rival court factions in Constantinople who resented his rise and who would, in time, prove more dangerous to him than the Seljuks themselves. In the summer of 1071, Romanos led a large Byzantine army, gathered from across the empire's remaining provincial forces and supplemented by various mercenary contingents, deep into eastern Anatolia toward the fortress town of Manzikert, near Lake Van, intending to confront the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, directly and settle the eastern frontier question with a single decisive campaign. And it is worth noting in this careful retelling that Alp Arslan himself had not initially sought a major confrontation with Byzantium at all, being more focused on affairs to his south in Syria and Egypt, and had in fact offered terms for peace that Romanos, confident in the size of his gathered army, chose to decline, a decision that would prove tragically consequential. The battle itself, fought on the 26th of August 1071, unfolded in a manner that reveals, in painful detail, just how fragile the empire's military cohesion had become beneath its still impressive appearance on paper, because as the Byzantine army maneuvered against the more mobile Seljuk horsemen, a rearguard commanded by a rival aristocrat named Andronikos Doukas, a man connected to a faction at court that had long resented Romanos's rise to power, either misunderstood the army's movements or, as many ancient and modern historians alike have suspected, deliberately withdrew from the field rather than support the emperor, and this collapse of the rearguard, combined with the defection of some of the army's Turkish mercenary contingents to the Seljuk side during the fighting itself, turned what might otherwise have been a difficult but survivable battle into a genuine disaster. The Byzantine center left isolated and eventually overwhelmed, and Romanos himself, fighting on, after most of his army had fled or been destroyed, was captured alive by Seljuk forces. What followed the battle itself is, in some ways, almost as significant as the defeat, because Alp Arslan, rather than treating his captive emperor with cruelty, is recorded by multiple sources as having received Romanos with genuine courtesy, negotiating terms for his release that were, by the standards of medieval warfare, remarkably moderate, a ransom and a peace treaty rather than any attempt to press deeper into the heart of the empire. And it is one of the more striking ironies of this entire episode that the battle's true catastrophe for Byzantium arose not from the Seljuk victory itself but from what happened next within the empire's own capital, because the same court faction that had undermined Romanos on the battlefield now moved against him politically, declaring him deposed the moment word of his capture reached Constantinople, and when Romanos, having secured his release from Seljuk captivity under the negotiated terms, attempted to reclaim his throne, he found himself instead facing a civil war against the new government installed in his absence, a war he ultimately lost, being captured a second time, this time by his own countrymen, and blinded in a manner so brutally performed that he died shortly afterward from the wounds. It was this internal chaos following Manzikert, far more than the battle itself, that opened Anatolia to Turkish settlement on a scale the empire would never fully reverse, because with the imperial government consumed by civil war and unable to mount any coordinated response, Turkish warbands, no longer merely raiding but now settling, moved steadily into the interior of Anatolia across the 1070s and 1080s, establishing what would become a lasting Turkish presence in a region that had been continuously Greek-speaking and Christian since long before the days of Constantine, a demographic and territorial transformation whose consequences would echo across the rest of Byzantine history and, indeed, well beyond it, into the modern shape of the region we today call Turkey. We should pause here on the particular sorrow of this chapter, because Manzikert has come to occupy, in the memory of later historians, a symbolic weight perhaps somewhat larger than the battle itself strictly warrants on purely military terms, a single defeat among many the empire had suffered and would suffer again, and yet it marks, quite genuinely, a hinge point in this long history, the moment after which the deep Anatolian heartland that had supplied Byzantium with so much of its soldiery, its grain, and its tax revenue across the preceding 4 centuries began, slowly but with gathering and ultimately irreversible momentum, to slip from Byzantine hands, a loss the empire would spend the rest of its existence, in one way or another, trying and largely failing to reverse. Out of this chaos, however, as so often happens in the long rhythm of Byzantine history, a new and genuinely capable dynasty would soon emerge, and it is to the rise of that dynasty, the Komnenoi, and to the remarkable, complicated relationship they would forge with a new and unfamiliar force arriving from Western Europe, the armies of the First Crusade, that we will turn our attention in the chapter that follows. But for now, let us simply rest with the image of the plain near Lake Van at dusk, the dust of battle long settled, the fortunes of an empire quietly, almost invisibly, beginning to shift beneath the feet of people who, on that particular August evening, could have had no way of knowing just how much that single day's fighting would come to mean. Out of the disorder that followed Manzikert, the civil wars, the loss of Anatolian territory, the rapid and destabilizing turnover of emperors through the 1070s, there emerged, in the year 1081, a new ruler whose family would go on to provide the empire with a period of genuine, if never entirely complete, recovery, and his name was Alexios Komnenos, a young general from a prominent Anatolian military family who had already, in his 20s, distinguished himself fighting against Norman adventurers in the Balkans and against rival claimants to the throne, and who seized power himself in a coup that, like so many transitions of power in this history, involved real violence, including a period during which his troops were permitted to sack portions of Constantinople itself, an episode Alexios reportedly regretted and sought, once securely in power, to atone for through extensive charitable religious foundations. The empire Alexios inherited in 1081 was, by any honest measure, in a genuinely precarious state, its Anatolian heartland substantially lost to Turkish settlement in the decade since Manzikert, its Balkan territories under simultaneous pressure from Norman adventurers pushing across from newly conquered southern Italy and from Pecheneg nomads raiding south of the Danube, its treasury depleted, and its once formidable military establishment reduced to a shadow of the force Basil II had commanded barely 2 generations earlier, and Alexios spent the opening years of his reign engaged in an almost constant, exhausting effort simply to hold these various fronts together, a period his own daughter, the historian and Princess Anna Komnene, would later describe in vivid and often quite moving detail in her history of her father's reign, a work that stands as one of the most valuable and most personal historical narratives to survive from the entire Byzantine period, written by a learned, cultured woman looking back with evident pride and affection on her father's difficult, unglamorous, but ultimately successful labor of restoration. It was in the midst of these ongoing struggles, in 1095, that Alexios made a diplomatic request that would set in motion consequences far beyond anything he could have anticipated, sending envoys to Pope Urban II in the West asking for military assistance, specifically for trained Western mercenary knights who could help bolster his own forces against continued Turkish pressure in Anatolia. A fairly modest and entirely conventional request by the standards of medieval diplomacy in which hiring foreign soldiers was a common and unremarkable practice, and it is one of the more genuinely surprising turns in this entire history that this practical, limited request became, in the hands of Pope Urban, the spark for something Alexios had neither asked for nor, in its final form, particularly wanted, because Urban, preaching later that same year at the Council of Clermont in France, transformed the request into a call for a great armed pilgrimage of the whole of Western Christendom, an expedition aimed not merely at providing Alexios with a few thousand hired knights but at recovering Jerusalem itself from Islamic rule, a call that ignited an extraordinary wave of religious enthusiasm across Western Europe and set in motion what history remembers as the First Crusade. What arrived at Constantinople beginning in 1096 and continuing through 1097 was, from Alexios's perspective, something considerably more complicated and considerably more alarming than the modest mercenary force he had originally requested. A series of large, independently commanded Western armies, some led by experienced and relatively disciplined nobles, others, in the case of the so-called People's Crusade, led by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit, consisting of poorly organized and poorly supplied masses of pilgrims and adventurers whose passage through Byzantine Balkan territory left a trail of local friction and occasional violent clashes with the very population they were nominally marching to defend. And Alexios, watching these substantial, independently minded Western forces converge on his capital, faced the genuinely delicate diplomatic task of extracting from their leaders an oath of loyalty, a promise to restore to Byzantine control any formerly Roman territory the Crusade might recapture from the Turks, before ferrying them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia. The relationship that developed between the Byzantines and the Crusaders across the following years was, from nearly the beginning, marked by a deep and, in retrospect, quite understandable mutual suspicion, because the Western knights, many of them devoutly convinced that their expedition was a sacred undertaking blessed directly by God, tended to view the sophisticated, wealthy, diplomatically pragmatic Byzantine court with a mixture of awe and resentment, suspecting, not always unfairly, that Alexios was more interested in using their military strength to recover his own lost territories than in supporting their more expansive religious ambitions toward Jerusalem, while the Byzantines, for their part, viewed the often undisciplined, sometimes genuinely destructive Western armies passing through their territory with a wary, sophisticated skepticism that Western sources, written from the Crusader perspective, frequently interpreted as duplicity or outright treachery, a mutual, cultural misunderstanding that would only deepen across the following century, with consequences that we will see unfold, with genuinely tragic weight, later in this history. Despite these tensions, the First Crusade did, in fact, deliver real benefits to Alexios in its early stages, helping Byzantine forces recover the important city of Nicaea and substantial portions of western Anatolia from Turkish control in 1097, restoring Byzantine authority along much of the Aegean coastline that had been lost in the chaotic decades following Manzikert, though the Crusaders, once they moved beyond territory Alexios considered his own immediate strategic interest, pressed on towards Syria and Jerusalem largely independent of continued Byzantine coordination, eventually capturing Jerusalem itself in 1099 in a conquest marked by violence that even by the standards of medieval warfare shocked many contemporary observers, and establishing a series of independent Crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast that owed, in the eyes of their own founders, little meaningful loyalty to the Byzantine emperor whatever oaths had been sworn back in Constantinople. Alexios ruled until his death in 1118, having succeeded, across nearly 4 decades on the throne, in the genuinely difficult task of stabilizing an empire that had seemed, at the moment of his accession, to be sliding toward outright collapse, and he was succeeded by his son, John II Komnenos, a ruler whose reign, lasting a quarter century until 1143, is remembered by Byzantine historians in almost uniformly admiring terms, a rarity in a historical tradition generally quite willing to record the flaws and failures of its emperors alongside their achievements, and John's reputation for personal piety, moderation, and genuine competence in both administration and military command earned him, among later Byzantine writers, the affectionate epithet Kaloyans, John the Good, a soldier emperor who spent much of his reign engaged in patient, methodical campaigning aimed at recovering further Byzantine territory in Anatolia and in reasserting imperial authority over the increasingly independent-minded Crusader Principality of Antioch. John's son and successor, Manuel I Komnenos, who ruled from 1143 to 1180, brought to the throne a rather different temperament, more overtly ambitious, more genuinely fascinated by and engaged with the culture and politics of Western Europe than either his father or grandfather had been, hosting Western knights at his court, participating personally in Western-style jousting tournaments that scandalized some of his more traditionally minded Byzantine subjects, and pursuing an active, sometimes overextended foreign policy that saw Byzantine forces intervene in southern Italy, in the Crusader states of the Levant, and in a major, ultimately catastrophic campaign against the resurgent Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, a campaign that ended in 1176 in a devastating Byzantine defeat at a mountain pass called Myriokephalon, an ambush that, while considerably less militarily decisive in its immediate consequences than Manzikert a century earlier, carried a similarly heavy symbolic weight, marking the effective end of any realistic Byzantine hope of fully reclaiming the Anatolian interior from Turkish control. Manuel's death in 1180 left the throne to a young son, Alexios II, and the instability that followed, a series of increasingly chaotic and often brutal succession struggles culminating in the brief, violently unpopular reign of a cousin named Andronikos Komnenos, whose harsh policies against the Constantinopolitan aristocracy ended with his own gruesome public execution by a mob in 1185, marked the effective close of the Komnenian Restoration, a century, roughly speaking, that had begun, with Alexios I rescuing an empire on the brink of collapse and that closed with the dynasty consuming itself in internal violence just as new and, as we will see in the chapter ahead, genuinely existential dangers were beginning to gather from the West. It is worth pausing, before we move into the darker chapters that lie ahead, to appreciate what the Komnenian century actually achieved, because for all its ultimate unraveling into renewed instability at its close, the period from 1081 to roughly 1180 saw the Byzantine Empire recover a substantial measure of its wealth, its military effectiveness, and its diplomatic standing among the powers of the medieval Mediterranean world, its capital, Constantinople, remaining, throughout the century, the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city that Western visitors, Crusader knights included, had ever personally seen, its markets filled with silk and spices and gold, its churches and palaces decorated with mosaics of a splendor that left even hardened Western warriors, men not typically given to easy wonder, recording their astonishment in letters home. And yet it is precisely this wealth, this visible, dazzling splendor, combined with the accumulated decades of mutual suspicion and resentment between Byzantines and Westerners that had been quietly building since the very first Crusader armies crossed the Bosphorus under Alexios I, that would help set the stage for the catastrophe we must now, with real sorrow, turn to describe, an event that would prove, in the long arc of this 11th century history, perhaps the single most devastating blow the city of Constantinople would suffer before its very final chapter, a wound from which, as we will see, the empire would never fully recover, and it is to that dark and painful episode, the sack of Constantinople in the year 1204, that our story must now, gently but honestly, turn. We approach this chapter more slowly and more gently than most, not because the events it describes were gentle, they were not, but because the weight of what happened to Constantinople in the spring of 1204 deserves to be told with care rather than sensationalism, and because understanding how it happened requires us to trace, patiently, a sequence of decisions, misunderstandings, and simple accidents of circumstance that, taken individually, might each have led somewhere quite different, but that together produced one of the genuine tragedies of medieval history. The Fourth Crusade began, in 1198, as a project conceived by Pope Innocent III with a straightforward, if ambitious, purpose, the recovery of Jerusalem, lost once again to Islamic forces under the great Muslim commander Saladin in 1187, and the great Western nobles who took up the cross in response to the Pope's call intended, in the beginning, nothing more complicated than sailing directly to Egypt, judged the most strategically sensible point of attack against the current Muslim power, controlling the Holy Land, and from there marching to retake Jerusalem itself, a plan that, notably, involved no intention whatsoever of passing anywhere near Constantinople. The difficulty that set this carefully planned expedition on its eventual disastrous detour was, at its root, a matter of simple logistics and finance, because the Crusader leadership had contracted with the Maritime Republic of Venice to build and supply a fleet large enough to transport their entire army by sea, a fleet that Venice, at very considerable expense to itself, duly constructed. But when the Crusader army actually gathered at Venice in the summer of 1202, it proved to be substantially smaller than the numbers originally projected, leaving the assembled force unable to pay the full sum owed to the Venetians for the fleet they had commissioned, and the aging but still formidably shrewd Venetian doge Enrico Dandolo, blind by this point in his life but reportedly still possessed of a sharp political mind, proposed a solution that would allow the debt to be worked off rather than simply forgiven, namely that the Crusader army, before proceeding toward its intended target, first assist Venice in recapturing the rebellious Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast, a proposal that, however commercially convenient for Venice, involved the deeply uncomfortable prospect of a crusading army, whose entire purpose was supposedly to fight in defense of Christendom, instead attacking a fellow Christian city, an act serious enough that Pope Innocent excommunicated the participants, though the excommunication was later quietly lifted for the Crusaders themselves, while remaining, more severely, in place against the Venetians. It was in the aftermath of this uncomfortable diversion to Zara that a second, even more consequential complication arrived, in the person of a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, son of a deposed and blinded emperor, Isaac II, who had been overthrown some years earlier by his own brother, and this young Alexios, having made his way to the west seeking support for his father's restoration, approached the Crusader leadership at Zara with an offer that must have seemed to financially strained commanders already uneasy about the moral compromises the expedition had already made, almost too good to refuse, a promise that if the Crusaders would first help restore his father Isaac and himself to the Byzantine throne, he would reward them with an enormous sum of money, sufficient to fully resolve their debt to Venice and fund the continuation of the crusade to Egypt and Jerusalem, along with additional troops and supplies for the eventual campaign in the Holy Land, and would furthermore work to heal the long-standing schism between the Greek Orthodox and Latin Catholic churches by bringing Byzantium under papal authority. The offer, examined with the benefit of the calm distance of history, rested on promises that young Alexios had, in truth, very little genuine capacity to fulfill, an inexperienced claimant vastly overestimating both the wealth actually available in the Byzantine treasury and the willingness of the Byzantine population and church to accept the sweeping religious concessions he had promised on their behalf without ever actually consulting them, but to the Crusade's leadership, weighed down by debt and eager for any solution that might resolve their difficulties and restore some sense of legitimate purpose to an expedition already badly compromised by the attack on Zara, the offer proved persuasive enough that the fleet, in the summer of 1203, altered its course a second time, sailing not toward Egypt but toward Constantinople itself. The Crusader fleet arrived before the walls of Constantinople in late June of 1203, and the sight that greeted the Western Knights, according to the vivid account left by the Crusader chronicler Geoffrey of Villehardouin, who participated in the expedition and recorded its events in considerable and evidently sincere astonishment, was of a city so vast, so wealthy, so far beyond anything these Western nobles had previously encountered, that many among them, by Villehardouin's own account, could scarcely believe such a place existed anywhere in the world, and it is worth sitting for a moment with this genuine wonder, because it captures something important about the disparity in scale and sophistication between Constantinople and the Western European world of this period, a disparity that would soon curdle, in the months that followed, into a far darker and more destructive form of fascination. The Crusaders' initial assault in the summer of 1203 succeeded, somewhat to their own surprise, in forcing the reigning emperor, the usurper who had blinded Isaac years earlier, to flee the city, and Isaac was accordingly restored to the throne alongside his son, now crowned as co-emperor Alexios IV. But the new joint regime proved almost immediately unable to deliver on the extravagant promises that had brought the Crusader army to the city's walls in the first place. The Byzantine treasury, drained by years of prior mismanagement and civil conflict, simply did not contain anything close to the sum young Alexios had promised, and desperate efforts to raise the money through heavy new taxation and the melting down of church treasures generated deep and rapidly spreading resentment among the ordinary population of Constantinople, resentment directed at both the restored emperors, seen increasingly as puppets of a foreign army camped just outside the city walls, and at the Crusaders themselves, whose continued presence, month after month through the winter of 1203 into 1204, grew steadily more strained and more hostile. By January of 1204, popular anger in Constantinople had grown severe enough that a palace coup, led by a court official who took the name Alexios V, overthrew and eventually had both Isaac and the younger Alexios IV killed, installing a regime explicitly hostile to the Crusader camp and determined to see the Western army finally depart. And it was this final collapse of any remaining diplomatic path forward, combined with the practical reality that the Crusader army, still deeply in debt and now facing open hostility from the very city they had come to restore to its rightful rulers, had few remaining options beyond either an ignominious retreat or an outright assault, that led, in the early spring of 1204, to the decision that would seal Constantinople's fate, an agreement among the Crusader and Venetian leadership to take the city by force and divide its wealth, its territory, and even its imperial title among themselves. The assault came on the 12th of April, 1204, and this time, unlike so many failed sieges across the preceding 8 centuries, Arab armies in the 7th and 8th centuries, various other attackers across the long span of Byzantine history, all turned back by the great Theodosian walls or by the empire's naval strength, the Crusaders succeeded, breaching the sea walls along the Golden Horn where Venetian ships, equipped with specially constructed scaling ladders and bridges, managed to gain a foothold, and the defense of the city, undermined by poor leadership under Alexios V and by a defending force that, whatever its numerical strength on paper, lacked the cohesion and morale to mount an effective resistance, collapsed with a speed that surprised even the attackers themselves. What followed, over the days that immediately followed the city's fall, was a sack of a severity and a duration that shocked contemporaries across the medieval world, Christian and Muslim alike, a city that had stood, essentially unconquered, as the greatest metropolis of the Christian world for nearly 900 years, subjected to days of organized and disorganized plunder, its churches, including Hagia Sophia itself, stripped of relics and treasures accumulated across centuries, its libraries and palaces looted and in places burned, its population subjected to violence that eyewitness accounts, including those written by Western participants themselves, describe in terms of open horror and shame. The Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates, who witnessed the sack firsthand and barely escaped the city with his own family, wrote an account of these days that remains one of the most harrowing pieces of testimony to survive from the entire medieval period, describing a crusader army that had, in his bitter and grieving words, come originally in the name of liberating the Holy Sepulchre but had instead visited upon a fellow Christian city a violence he found difficult to distinguish from anything the most feared enemies of Christendom might have inflicted. The material losses were, by any measure, staggering and in many respects irreplaceable. An incalculable quantity of ancient and Byzantine art, sculpture, manuscripts, and sacred relics either destroyed outright or carried away to churches and treasuries across Western Europe, where a considerable number of Byzantine treasures looted in 1204 remain to this day, including, most famously, the 4 great bronze horses removed from the Hippodrome in Constantinople and installed above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, where they still stand, a permanent physical reminder of this catastrophic episode, visible to any modern visitor who cares to look up and consider their origin. Beyond the material devastation, the conquerors proceeded to formally dismantle the Byzantine state itself, dividing its territory among the Crusader leadership and installing a Latin emperor, Baldwin of Flanders, on a newly established throne in Constantinople, creating what history calls the Latin Empire, a fragile, culturally foreign regime that never succeeded in winning the genuine loyalty of its Greek Orthodox subjects, and that would survive for less than 6 decades before Byzantine forces, in a story we will follow in our next chapter, eventually succeeded in reclaiming their ancient capital, but the empire that was restored in 1261 would never again possess the full territorial extent, the full wealth, or the full unquestioned prestige of the empire that had existed before that terrible spring of 1204. We close this difficult chapter, as we do the others, gently, resisting the urge to dwell too long in its sorrow, but honoring, all the same, the genuine weight of what was lost, a 900-year record of continuity broken, for the first time in its long history, by conquest, and it is worth remembering, as we move forward into the empire's long resilient, but never quite complete recovery, that the Byzantines themselves did not regard 1204 as an ending, however catastrophic it appeared in the moment, but rather in keeping with the remarkable persistence that had already carried the civilization through plague and siege and controversy across nearly 9 centuries, as a devastating setback from which recovery, however partial, however incomplete, remained, in their own minds, always the goal. In the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe of 1204, with Constantinople itself in the hands of a Latin emperor and Crusader lords carving up Byzantine territory into a patchwork of feudal principalities across Greece and the Aegean Islands, it might have seemed, to any reasonable observer surveying the wreckage, that the Byzantine state, the unbroken continuation of Rome that had endured for close to 9 centuries since Constantine first dedicated his new capital, had finally and permanently come to its end. And yet this is precisely the moment in our story where the remarkable resilience that has run as a quiet thread through every previous chapter reasserts itself once again, because Byzantine resistance to the Latin conquest did not simply collapse alongside the fall of the capital, but instead reorganized itself, with real speed and real determination, around several surviving centers of Greek political and military strength scattered across what remained of the old imperial territory. The most successful and most historically significant of these successor states arose in the region of northwestern Anatolia around the city of Nicaea, itself a city already heavy with symbolic weight in the Byzantine imagination as the site of the great church councils of 325 and 787, and it was here, under the leadership of a capable nobleman named Theodore Lascaris, a son-in-law of the last legitimate emperor before the Latin conquest, that a genuinely functional Byzantine government in exile took shape in the years immediately following 1204, complete with its own Patriarch of Constantinople, relocated to Nicaea since the Latin conquerors had installed their own Catholic Patriarch in the actual Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, and its own imperial court, army, and administration, all operating on the explicit and unwavering premise that this was not some new state but the legitimate Roman Empire itself, temporarily displaced from its rightful capital but fully intending, in due course, to return. Theodore Lascaris, crowned emperor in Nicaea in 1208, and his successors across the following half-century built, out of what remained of Byzantine territory and Byzantine institutional memory, a state that proved, in several important respects, more effectively governed and more militarily disciplined than the fractured, aristocratically fragmented empire of the years immediately preceding 1204 had been, its rulers drawing on a smaller, more manageable territorial base to rebuild a genuinely capable army and a sound fiscal administration, and it was under the third of these Nicaean emperors, John III Vatatzes, who ruled from 1221 to 1254, that this recovery reached its fullest and most impressive expression, John proving himself, across a long and remarkably successful reign, to be one of the more genuinely gifted administrators in the entire span of Byzantine history, expanding Nicaean territory steadily at the expense of both the weakening Latin Empire and rival Greek successor states, promoting agricultural development and self-sufficiency within his territories with a personal attention to practical economic policy that later Byzantine writers recalled with particular admiration, reportedly establishing royal farms and even, according to one often repeated anecdote, funding his wife's imperial crown from the proceeds of eggs sold from poultry he kept for this specific purpose, a small, homely detail that later chroniclers seem to have delighted in, recording precisely because it illustrated so vividly the practical, unglamorous diligence that underpinned Nicaea's genuine and substantial recovery. By the time of John Vatatzes' death in 1254, the Empire of Nicaea had grown strong enough that the eventual recovery of Constantinople itself had become, in the minds of most observers on both sides of the conflict, less a question of whether it would happen than simply of when, and the actual recapture of the ancient capital, when it finally came in 1261, arrived in a manner that even its own participants seemed to have found almost anticlimactic given how central the goal of reclaiming Constantinople had been to Nicaean political identity for the preceding half-century, because the city fell not through any grand climactic siege but through what was, essentially, a fortunate accident of circumstance, a Nicaean general named Alexios Strategopoulos, leading what was intended as a modest raiding expedition rather than any full-scale assault on the city itself, learned from local informants that the bulk of the Latin garrison, along with the Venetian fleet that provided much of Constantinople's naval defense, happened to be absent from the city at that particular moment, engaged in a campaign elsewhere in the region, and Strategopoulos, seizing this unexpected opportunity, managed to slip a small force through an unguarded section of the walls under cover of darkness in the early hours of the 25th of July, 1261, opening the gates from within before the largely undefended city's remaining Latin authorities, including the reigning Latin Emperor Baldwin II, could organize any meaningful resistance, Baldwin himself reportedly fleeing the city in such haste that he left behind his own imperial crown and scepter. The Byzantine emperor at this pivotal moment, Michael VIII Palaiologos, who had risen to power in Nicaea a few years earlier through a combination of genuine military talent, and a rather less admirable pattern of political maneuvering that included displacing the legitimate young heir of the Laskrid dynasty and eventually having the boy blinded to eliminate any future claim to the throne. A dark episode that would cast a long shadow over the moral legitimacy of his own subsequent reign. In the eyes of many of his own Orthodox subjects, was not himself present in the city at the moment of its recapture, and the famous accounts of his eventual formal entry into Constantinople describe a notably humble ceremony, Michael entering the city on foot rather than on horseback, following behind a revered icon of the Virgin Mary carried in procession before him, walking barefoot in a deliberate display of pious gratitude through the very gate by which the city had, in his understanding, been restored to its rightful people through what he sincerely believed to be divine favor rather than mere military fortune. The restoration of 1261, however genuinely celebrated at the time as the fulfillment of more than half a century of hope and struggle, inaugurated an era for the Byzantine state that historians, looking back with the clarity that only distance affords, generally recognize as one of steady, if uneven, decline rather than any genuine return to the empire's former power, because the Constantinople that Michael VIII reclaimed in 1261 was, in crucial and lasting ways, a diminished shadow of the city it had been before 1204, its population substantially reduced from the perhaps 500,000 or more inhabitants of the 11th and 12th centuries to a much smaller number scattered across a city whose grand public buildings, palaces, and churches had, in many cases, been left in various states of disrepair or outright ruin by nearly 6 decades of impoverished and disinterested Latin rule. Entire districts of the once teeming metropolis reduced to open fields and orchards within the still standing but now largely emptied circuit of the Theodosian walls. Michael VIII, whatever the moral compromises of his rise to power, proved himself, across a reign lasting until his death in 1282, a genuinely energetic and capable ruler in the difficult work of consolidating this fragile restoration, engaging in careful, often quite skillful diplomacy aimed at preventing any renewed Western crusade against Constantinople of the kind that had proven so catastrophic in 1204, going so far as to negotiate, in 1274, a formal reunion of the Greek Orthodox and Latin Catholic churches at the Council of Lyon, a diplomatic maneuver intended primarily to remove the papal justification for any future Western attack on Byzantium rather than reflecting any genuine theological consensus, and this reunion, deeply unpopular among the Byzantine clergy and much of the ordinary population, who regarded it as a cynical betrayal of Orthodox tradition for the sake of political expediency, would prove short-lived, formally repudiated by Michael's own son and successor almost immediately after Michael's death, but it served its immediate diplomatic purpose during Michael's own lifetime in helping the fragile restored empire survive its first vulnerable decades. We should pause, before closing this chapter, on the particular texture of daily life within this restored but diminished capital, because even a Constantinople reduced in population and grandeur from its earlier heights remained, by the standards of the 13th century Mediterranean world, a place of considerable, if faded, sophistication, its scholars continuing the long Byzantine tradition of preserving and studying classical literature, its churches, those that had survived the depredations of the Latin occupation relatively intact, continuing to hold the elaborate liturgical ceremonies that had marked Byzantine religious life for centuries, and its merchants, though now operating in a commercial landscape increasingly dominated by the rival Italian maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, whose ships and trading colonies had, in the decades of Latin rule, established a grip on Mediterranean and Black Sea commerce that the restored Byzantine state would never fully manage to dislodge, continuing to conduct the business of a city that, whatever its reduced circumstances, still occupied one of the most strategically valuable pieces of geography in the entire medieval world. It is this last point, the empire's increasing commercial and, in time, military dependence on these same Italian maritime powers whose merchant colonies now controlled so much of the trade passing through Byzantine waters, that would prove one of the defining and increasingly troubling features of Byzantine political life across the century and a half that remained to the empire following its 1261 restoration, a slow, complicated, often resentful relationship of dependency that would tangle itself again and again through the internal conflicts and external crises that mark the final chapters of this long history, and it is to those final, often difficult centuries, the age of the Palaeologan dynasty that Michael VIII founded, an era marked by devastating civil wars, by the slow, grinding advance of a new and ultimately decisive threat rising in Anatolia, and by a cultural and intellectual flowering that, remarkably, accompanied the empire's political decline rather than being extinguished by it, that we will turn our attention in the chapters that follow. For now, let us rest with the image of Michael VIII walking barefoot through the gates of his recovered capital, the icon of the Virgin carried solemnly before him, the streets around him lined with citizens weeping, according to the chroniclers, with a mixture of joy and disbelief, the long exile of the Byzantine state finally, after 57 years, brought to its quiet, humble, and deeply felt conclusion. The century and a half that followed the restoration of 1261 is, in many respects, the most quietly poignant portion of this entire history, because it is a period in which the Byzantine state, even as its territorial power steadily and at times dramatically contracted, even as its treasury grew ever thinner and its once formidable armies shrank to a fraction of their earlier strength, nonetheless continued to produce, within the walls of its diminished capital, scholarship, art, and theological reflection of a depth and sophistication that many historians regard as one of the genuine high points of medieval Byzantine intellectual culture, a strange and moving paradox that we should sit with carefully as we move through these final imperial centuries. Michael VIII's son and successor, Andronikos II, who reigned for an unusually long stretch from 1282 until his forced abdication in 1328, presided over a reign that illustrates this paradox with particular clarity, because Andronikos was, by most accounts, a genuinely cultured and intellectually engaged ruler, a patron of scholars and theologians, personally interested in questions of philosophy and religious doctrine, and yet his reign also saw a series of consequential and, in hindsight, damaging fiscal and military decisions, including a severe reduction in naval spending that left the empire increasingly dependent on Genoese and Venetian ships even for its own basic defense, and the hiring, in 1303, of a large mercenary force of Catalan and Aragonese soldiers, veterans of wars in Sicily, brought in specifically to help push back renewed Turkish pressure in Anatolia. This mercenary company, known to history as the Catalan Grand Company, did indeed win real victories against Turkish forces in Anatolia in the years immediately following their arrival, but the relationship between these hired soldiers and their Byzantine employers soured with startling speed, the Catalans growing resentful over disputes about pay, and the Byzantine court growing increasingly alarmed by the independent, often predatory behavior of a mercenary force that had, in effect, become almost as dangerous to Byzantine territory and Byzantine civilians as the Turkish raiders they had originally been hired to fight, and this deteriorating relationship culminated in 1305 in the assassination of the company's own commander at Byzantine instigation, an act of betrayal, however strategically motivated, that provoked the surviving Catalans into a campaign of savage retaliatory devastation across Byzantine Thrace and Macedonia that Byzantine sources describe in terms of genuine horror before the company eventually moved on to conquer and establish its own independent lordship over the Duchy of Athens, leaving behind a swath of devastated Byzantine territory that the empire's already strained resources would struggle for years to recover. Andronikos II's final years were further darkened by a bitter and destructive civil war against his own grandson, the future Andronikos III, a conflict fought intermittently from 1321 to 1328 that further drained the empire's already limited military and financial resources at precisely the moment when a new and, in the long run, far more consequential power was quietly consolidating itself in northwestern Anatolia, directly across the water from Constantinople itself, a small but rapidly expanding beylik or principality, led by a Turkish chieftain named Osman, whose followers would, within a few generations, transform this modest frontier statelet into the Ottoman Empire, the very power that would, more than a century later, bring the Byzantine story to its final close. The reign of Andronikos III, from 1328 to 1341, saw some genuine military successes, particularly in reclaiming certain Aegean territories, but it was the period immediately following his death that brought upon the empire perhaps the single most destructive civil conflict of its entire final century, a war fought between the regency government established for Andronikos's young son, John V, and a powerful and ambitious aristocrat named John Kantakouzenos, a close friend and advisor of the late emperor who felt, not without some justification given his own considerable political and military standing, that he had been unfairly excluded from the regency government, and this civil war, dragging on from 1341 to 1347, proved catastrophic for an empire that could ill afford such internal bloodletting, both sides drawing on foreign mercenaries and foreign allies, including Serbian and Bulgarian forces on various sides of the conflict, and in a decision whose long-term consequences would prove genuinely fateful. Cantacuzeninos at one point brought Turkish mercenary forces, drawn from the very Ottoman Beylik whose steady expansion should have alarmed rather than assisted Byzantine political factions, across into Europe to support his own claim to power, granting these Ottoman forces their very first foothold on European soil at Gallipoli in 1354, a foothold the Ottomans would never subsequently relinquish and that would serve as the springboard for their steady conquest over the following century of nearly the entire Balkan Peninsula. It is difficult, in retelling this sequence of events, not to feel the particular sorrow of watching an empire, already so reduced from its former strength, actively contribute, through its own internal rivalries, to the rise of the very power that would eventually destroy it, and yet this pattern, internal Byzantine political conflict inadvertently strengthening external enemies, recurs with a kind of tragic regularity across these final Paleologan decades, a reminder that decline, in the long history of states, is rarely simply imposed from outside but is very often, at least in part, a matter of internal choices made under genuine pressure and with imperfect knowledge of their eventual consequences. Even amid this political and military unraveling, however, the intellectual and cultural life of the shrinking empire continued to produce work of remarkable depth, and it is worth pausing, in this calm retelling, to appreciate the genuine achievements of what historians often call the Paleologan Renaissance, a flowering of scholarship, theology, and art that unfolded across these very decades of territorial contraction, centered particularly in Constantinople itself and in the city of Mistras. In the Peloponnese, which developed, during this period, into a genuinely significant secondary center of Byzantine learning and artistic production, its churches decorated with frescoes of a naturalism and emotional expressiveness that art historians have long recognized as anticipating, in certain respects, developments that would soon unfold in the Italian Renaissance taking shape not so very far away across the Adriatic. This period also saw a significant theological controversy, known as the Hesychast controversy, centered on a distinctive tradition of contemplative prayer practiced particularly among monks on Mount Athos, a controversy that pitted defenders of this mystical tradition, most notably the theologian Gregory Palamas, against critics who regarded some of its claims about the direct, personal experience of divine light as theologically suspect, a debate conducted with the same intellectual seriousness and careful argumentation that had characterized Byzantine theological disputes since the earliest centuries of the Church, and one that, after extended and sometimes heated debate, was ultimately resolved in favor of the Hesychast position at church councils held in Constantinople in the 1340s, a resolution that would shape Orthodox Christian spirituality for centuries afterward and that remains influential within Orthodox monastic practice to this day. Meanwhile, the political and territorial situation continued its steady contraction. John V, who eventually emerged from the civil wars of the 1340s to rule, with several interruptions caused by further internal challenges including from his own son, until 1391, presided over an empire increasingly reduced to little more than Constantinople itself, a scattering of Aegean islands, and the semi-autonomous Byzantine territory around Mistras in the Peloponnese known as the Despotate of Morea. And it was during John's reign, in 1354, that a devastating earthquake struck the Gallipoli Peninsula, destroying its fortifications at the very moment Ottoman forces were seeking to establish themselves there, an event that, whatever its purely coincidental timing, seemed to contemporary observers almost providentially favorable to the Ottoman cause, opening the way for the permanent Ottoman settlement of the region we mentioned just a moment ago. By the later decades of the 14th century, the Byzantine emperor's political position had grown so genuinely weak that John V found himself, on more than one occasion, in the deeply humbling position of traveling personally to Western European courts, to Hungary, to Venice, even to Rome, seeking military or financial assistance against the steadily advancing Ottoman threat, journeys that yielded disappointingly little concrete aid and that saw the aging emperor, on at least one occasion in Venice, effectively detained over unpaid debts until his own son could arrange the funds necessary to secure his release, a genuinely painful image of imperial dignity reduced to such practical indignity, and by the end of his reign, John V had, in fact, been compelled to formally acknowledge Ottoman overlordship, agreeing to pay tribute and even, on at least one documented occasion, to provide troops in support of Ottoman military campaigns. The once mighty Roman emperor, now functioning in practical political terms as something uncomfortably close to a vassal of the very power steadily encircling what remained of his territory. We will follow, in the chapter that lies ahead, the final wrenching decades of this long decline, the desperate diplomatic efforts of John V's successors to secure meaningful Western military assistance, the brief and ultimately catastrophic attempt at a broader crusade against the advancing Ottomans, and the slow, inexorable tightening of the circle around Constantinople itself. But for now, let us pause here in this strange and moving twilight, a city whose political power had shrunk to a fraction of its former extent, whose emperors traveled as supplicants to foreign courts, and yet whose monasteries and scriptoriums continued, all the while, to produce theology and philosophy and art of genuine and lasting depth, a civilization that, even as its earthly power visibly waned, continued to insist, through the very persistence of its intellectual and spiritual life, on the enduring value of everything it had built across its long and remarkable history. We arrive now at the final chapter of this long history, and we arrive at it slowly and gently, as befits a story that, whatever the drama of its ending, deserves to be told with the same quiet, unhurried care we have tried to bring to every chapter that came before it, because the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is not, in truth, a sudden event at all, but the final, carefully prepared culmination of forces that had been gathering, as we have seen across the preceding chapters, for well over a century. By the early decades of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced, in territorial terms, to little more than the city of Constantinople itself and its immediate surroundings, along with the semi-independent despotate of Morea in the Peloponnese, an almost absurdly small territorial base for a state that continued, out of an unbroken sense of its own historical identity, to maintain the full ceremonial apparatus of Roman imperial government, its emperors still crowned with ancient titles, its courts still observing protocols that traced their lineage back through Justinian to Constantine and beyond, even as the practical substance of imperial power had shrunk to something scarcely larger than a single fortified city-state. The Ottoman state that now surrounded this last fragment of Byzantine territory on every landward side had, across the century and a half since its first tentative foothold at Gallipoli, grown into one of the most formidable military powers in the entire medieval world, its sultans having conquered the great bulk of the Balkan Peninsula, defeating a major crusading army sent from Western Europe at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396 and, after a temporary setback caused by the Mongol conqueror, Timur's defeat and capture of the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid in 1402, a defeat that briefly threw the young Ottoman state into a period of internal civil war among Bayezid's sons and that gave Constantinople a genuine, if ultimately only temporary, reprieve, resuming its steady expansion under subsequent sultans until, by the middle of the 15th century, the Byzantine capital sat as an isolated Christian enclave almost entirely surrounded by Ottoman territory on both the European and Asian shores of the Bosphorus. The final emperor to preside over this last, diminished remnant of the Roman state was Constantine XI Palaeologos, who came to the throne in 1449, and there is something quietly fitting, in a history that began with an emperor named Constantine founding the city in 330, that it should close, 11 centuries and more than 90 emperors later, with another Constantine presiding over its final defense, though we should be careful not to lean too heavily on this symmetry as though it were some deliberate design of history rather than simple coincidence, because Constantine XI himself, by every account that survives of his character, was a genuinely capable, personally courageous, and deeply conscientious ruler who devoted the 4 years of his brief reign almost entirely to the increasingly desperate task of trying to secure his capital's survival, traveling in earlier years, before his own accession, on diplomatic missions to the courts of Western Europe seeking military assistance, and continuing, once emperor, to send appeals to Rome, to Venice, to Hungary, appeals that yielded, in the end, only modest and ultimately insufficient support. Part of the difficulty in securing substantial Western aid lay in the long, painful legacy of religious division between the Greek Orthodox and Latin Catholic churches, a division that stretched back, as we discussed in an earlier chapter, through centuries of accumulated theological dispute and, more viscerally, through the still bitter memory of the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, and although a formal reunion of the churches had once again been negotiated, at the Council of Florence in 1439, in a fresh attempt to secure the Western military support that reunion was hoped to unlock, this agreement proved, much like Michael VIII's earlier attempt at reunion in 1274, deeply unpopular among the Byzantine clergy and much of the ordinary population of Constantinople. many of whom regarded submission to papal authority as a betrayal of orthodox tradition that they preferred to resist even at the cost of their own city's safety, a sentiment famously, if perhaps not entirely literally, captured in a remark attributed to a Byzantine official of the period who declared that he would rather see the turban of the Sultan ruling in the city than the mitre of a Latin cardinal, a sentiment that, whether spoken in precisely those words or not, genuinely reflects the depth of religious feeling that complicated Byzantium's final desperate search for allies. The Ottoman Sultan who would ultimately bring the 11th century Byzantine story to its close was a young and formidably capable ruler named Mehmed II, who came to the Ottoman throne for the second time, having briefly held it once before as a teenager, in 1451, at just 19 years of age, and who seems to have resolved, from very nearly the outset of his reign, upon the conquest of Constantinople as his defining and most consuming ambition, a young man whose contemporaries, both Ottoman and Byzantine, describe as possessing a genuinely voracious intellectual curiosity, fluent in several languages, deeply read in history and in the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and possessed of a methodical, patient, and technically innovative approach to the military problem that this ancient, formidably walled city presented. Mehmed's preparations for the siege were extensive and, in certain crucial respects, genuinely without precedent, and the most significant of these preparations involved artillery, because Mehmed, recognizing that the massive Theodosian walls that had turned back every previous serious assault on the city across more than 1,000 years of siege warfare would require an entirely new category of weapon to overcome, commissioned an enormous bronze cannon, built by a Hungarian founder named Orban, who had, in one of the more poignant footnotes to this story, first offered his services to the Byzantines, who lacked the funds to properly employ him, before turning to the Ottoman Sultan, whose treasury proved considerably more capable of financing such an ambitious project, and the resulting cannon, requiring dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to transport from the Ottoman capital at Edirne to the walls of Constantinople, could reportedly fire a stone ball weighing over half a ton, a weapon of a scale that represented a genuine and consequential leap forward in the history of siege warfare. The siege itself began in early April of 1453, with an Ottoman army whose size, though ancient sources vary considerably and modern historians treat the larger contemporary estimates with appropriate caution, substantially outnumbered the defending forces, which Constantine XI had managed to assemble from the city's own limited population, supplemented by a relatively small number of foreign volunteers, most notably a contingent of Genoese soldiers under an experienced condottiere, named Giovanni Justiniani, who had arrived, largely at his own initiative and expense, to assist in the city's defense, and whose military expertise would prove genuinely valuable across the weeks of siege that followed. And it is worth pausing on the sheer scale of this disparity, a defending garrison numbering, by most careful modern estimates, somewhere in the range of 7,000 to 8,000 men attempting to hold a wall circuit nearly 4 miles in length against an attacking force many times that size. Across the weeks that followed, the defenders, remarkably, held their ancient walls against repeated Ottoman assaults and sustained artillery bombardment, the great cannon and its companion guns gradually wearing down sections of the Theodosian fortifications that had stood essentially unbroken for 1,000 years, sections the defenders worked through each night, with real and sustained heroism, to repair using earth and timber and whatever materials could be gathered, and the city's naval defenses along the Golden Horn proved similarly resilient in these opening weeks, a chain stretched across the mouth of the harbor successfully preventing Ottoman ships from entering and threatening the sea walls along that more vulnerable stretch of the city's defenses, a naval blockade that Mehmed responded to with a characteristically bold and resourceful solution, having a number of his ships hauled overland on greased wooden rollers along a route north of the city, bypassing the chain entirely and launching them directly into the waters of the Golden Horn, a maneuver that genuinely stunned the city's defenders when they woke to find enemy vessels inside the previously secure harbor. Despite this and other setbacks, the defense held through April and into May, and there were moments, according to accounts from both sides, when the outcome genuinely seemed to hang in real and uncertain balance, the defenders exhausted but unbroken, the Ottoman forces themselves, according to some accounts, growing weary enough after weeks of costly and unsuccessful assault that Mehmed faced real pressure from within his own council to consider abandoning the siege altogether, and it is worth sitting for a moment with this genuine uncertainty, resisting the temptation that hindsight always offers to treat the eventual outcome as though it had been inevitable from the very beginning, because to the men actually standing on those walls through the long weeks of April and into May of 1453, the outcome was very far from certain. The final assault came in the early hours of the 29th of May, 1453, a massive coordinated attack launched under cover of darkness against multiple sections of the wall simultaneously, and the defense, which had held for so many previous assaults, finally began to give way, in part through the sheer accumulated exhaustion of defenders who had, by this point, been fighting and repairing walls almost without proper rest for close to 2 months, and in part through a series of specific, painful misfortunes, including a wound suffered by the Genoese commander Justiniani that forced his withdrawal from the walls at a genuinely critical moment, a withdrawal that seems to have triggered a wider collapse of morale among the defenders in that section of the fortifications, and, according to several accounts, the discovery by Ottoman forces of a small postern gate, called the Kirkaporta, that had been left carelessly unlocked, allowing a group of attackers to slip inside the walls and begin attacking the defenders from behind at the very moment the main assault was pressing hardest from without. Constantine XI, according to the most credible surviving accounts, spent these final hours where an emperor of Rome, in the truest and most literal sense of that ancient title, belonged, on the walls themselves alongside his soldiers, and when it became clear, in these final chaotic hours, that the city's defenses had genuinely and irreversibly failed, the emperor is said to have removed the imperial insignia that marked him as a target for capture and to have thrown himself into the final desperate fighting alongside his remaining soldiers rather than seek any personal escape, and his actual fate, in the confusion of that final morning, was never conclusively established. His body, if indeed it was ever positively identified among the dead at all, never recovered in any manner that satisfied later historians, a genuinely fitting, if profoundly sad, final mystery for a man who had spent his entire brief reign in the mostly thankless, mostly unrewarded labor of trying to preserve something that history, by that point, had very largely already decided could not, in the end, be preserved. Sultan Mehmed II entered the city later that same day, the 29th of May, 1453, riding to Hagia Sophia itself, which he ordered converted into a mosque, a transformation that would define the great building's function for the following 481 years until, in the 20th century, the secular Turkish Republic converted it into a museum, before its status was changed once again, in 2020, back to a functioning mosque, a long afterlife of continued transformation and continued significance for a building whose golden dome, remarkably, still stands today, very nearly 15 centuries after Justinian first raised it above the ashes of the Nika riots, one of the very few tangible threads still connecting the modern visitor to the whole of the long history we have traced together across these chapters. Mehmed, whatever the genuine violence of the city's fall itself, a violence that ancient accounts, Byzantine and later Ottoman alike, describe with real and appropriate sorrow, moved fairly quickly, once the city was securely his, to begin the work of restoring and repopulating a capital he intended not to leave as ruins but to make once again the flourishing center of a great empire, inviting merchants, craftsmen, and scholars of various faiths and backgrounds to resettle within its walls, and appointing a new Greek Orthodox patriarch to lead the city's substantial surviving Christian population under Ottoman rule, decisions that reflect a ruler who understood, with real political sophistication, that the value of Constantinople lay not merely in its conquest but in its continued life as a great imperial capital, a role the city would indeed continue to play, now as the seat of Ottoman rather than Byzantine power, for close to another 5 centuries. And so, on this quiet, sorrowful note, the 11th century story of the Byzantine Empire, the unbroken continuation of Rome that had survived plague and earthquake, religious controversy and civil war, the armies of Persia and the armies of the Arab Caliphate and the armies of the Fourth Crusade, finally, gently, came to its close, not with any sudden or total annihilation of everything it had built, but with the quiet transition of a great city, weary after so very long a history, into the hands of a new power that would, in its own way, continue to draw upon and to honor much of what this long Byzantine story had created, and it is with this sense of continuity even in ending, rather than any sense of total or violent erasure, that we will close our own retelling in the final brief chapter that follows, resting together in the long, enduring afterlife of everything this remarkable civilization left behind. There is a certain kind of peace that comes from tracing a long story all the way to its ending and then, rather than stopping abruptly there, allowing ourselves a little more time to notice everything that quietly persisted afterward, And it is in that spirit that we close this history, not at the walls of Constantinople on that May morning in 1453, but a little further on in the long, patient afterlife of everything the Byzantine world had built across its 11 centuries. Consider, first, the law. The great codification that Justinian commissioned in the 6th century, the Corpus Juris Civilis, gathered and organized by the scholar Tribonian and his colleagues, did not vanish with the empire that produced it, but survived, copied and studied across the medieval centuries, to become, many hundreds of years later, one of the central foundations upon which the legal systems of continental Europe were built, its influence traceable today in the civil law traditions of dozens of modern nations, a quiet Byzantine inheritance woven so thoroughly into the modern world that most people who live under its influence have never once heard the name of the emperor whose lawyers first gathered it together. Consider, too, the shape of the Christian Orthodox world. The theology worked out across the great church councils that met in and around Constantinople, the distinctive liturgical traditions, the visual language of the icon that survived the century-long controversy of iconoclasm to flower into one of the great artistic traditions of the medieval and modern world. All of this passed, in the centuries before and after 1453, northward into Russia, westward and southward into the Balkans, carried by missionaries and travelers and simple cultural exchange, so that the Orthodox churches of Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece that continue to this day to hold services shaped by patterns first developed in Byzantine Constantinople, are themselves a living, breathing continuation of the civilization whose political story we have just finished tracing. Consider the manuscripts. Across the final desperate century of Byzantine political decline, as the empire's territory shrank and its treasury emptied, Byzantine scholars, sensing perhaps the gathering danger, carried an increasing number of ancient Greek texts westward into Italy, and the scholars who fled Constantinople in the years around 1453 itself, along with those who had already been making this journey for decades before the city's final fall, brought with them not merely manuscripts but a living tradition of Greek scholarship that fed directly, and by the testimony of the Italian humanists themselves quite consequentially, into the flowering of the Italian Renaissance already underway in cities like Florence and Venice, a final, quiet gift from a dying empire to the civilization that would, in certain respects, succeed it as the cultural center of the European world. And consider, finally, the Great Dome itself, still rising today above the waters of the Bosphorus exactly where Justinian's architects raised it very nearly 1,500 years ago, a building that has been, across its long life, a Christian cathedral for 9 centuries, a mosque for nearly 5 centuries after that, briefly a museum, and now, once again, a mosque, each transformation a genuine and significant change. And yet the building itself, its vast dome, its golden light standing through every one of these changes as a single continuous physical thread connecting the modern visitor, whoever they are, wherever they come from, whatever they believe, to the whole of the extraordinary history we have spent these chapters together tracing. We began this history at dusk on the waters of the Strait, with the image of a small Greek trading town on a rocky peninsula, and we close it, many centuries later, with the recognition that almost nothing about that small town's later life was inevitable, that at any number of points across these 11 centuries, plague, siege, civil war, the sack of 1204 itself, the story could very plausibly have ended many hundreds of years earlier than it did, and that its actual persistence, its genuine and repeated capacity to absorb catastrophe and rebuild, chapter after chapter, decade after decade, is itself one of the more remarkable and more quietly instructive facts in the whole of human history, a reminder, if we care to take it as one, that endurance is very rarely a matter of avoiding hardship altogether, and very often, instead, simply a matter of continuing, patiently, faithfully, to rebuild after each hardship has passed. Let that thought settle now, gently, as this long telling comes to its own quiet close, the last light fading once more over the waters of the Bosphorus, the dome of Hagia Sophia catching, as it always has, whatever light remains, and the whole long story we have shared together across these chapters finally, softly, allowed to rest.